Victor Hale signed the documents on a Tuesday morning, smiling. That was what the secretary remembered most. Not the stack of papers, not the legal language, not even the way he slid the folder across the table toward Adrian Blackwell, like it was nothing. She remembered the smile, easy and unbothered, the kind a man wears when he's already certain of the outcome. Across the table, Adrian's pen moved. His signature appeared at the bottom of a divorce decree, and somewhere across the city, in a hospital bed, a woman named Naomi Carter pressed her hands against her stomach and wept without making a sound, because she already knew she had already lost. If you've made it this far, stay with me. This story is going to take you somewhere you won't forget. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this one travels. Now let's go back to where it all started, and how it finally, painfully, came undone. The morning Adrian Blackwell walked into the Meridian Tower conference room, he was running 4 minutes late, which almost never happened. His assistant had flagged a traffic delay on the bridge, but Adrian had dismissed the alternate route and sat in the back of his car watching the minutes tick by with the particular irritation of a man who controlled most things and hated the few he couldn't. By the time the elevator opened on the 41st floor, he'd already reviewed the acquisition brief twice on his phone, already mentally drafted his opening position, already decided this negotiation would take no longer than 90 minutes. He'd been wrong about a lot of things in his life. He was wrong about this too. The Meridian project was, on paper, exactly the kind of deal Adrian's company had been structured to pursue. A 12-acre waterfront redevelopment in the heart of the city, residential towers, commercial space, a public promenade, with a projected value that would ultimately settle somewhere north of $1.5 billion. The development rights had been locked in an ownership dispute for 3 years before finally clearing through arbitration, and now 2 firms were circling the table. Blackwell Holdings was one. The other was a firm Adrian had researched but found surprisingly thin on public footprint. CNC Development Group, founded approximately 7 years ago, headquartered in a mid-sized coastal city 3 hours south, privately held, no public filings beyond what was legally required. A boutique operation that had, by all measurable metrics, quietly become one of the most successful sustainable architecture and development firms in the country. The CEO's name wasn't in the brief. That was unusual but not alarming. Some executives preferred anonymity in early negotiation stages. It kept the focus on the deal rather than personalities. Adrian had assumed he'd be meeting some regional developer who'd gotten lucky on a few projects and was now punching above his weight class. He was not prepared for what walked through the door. He almost didn't recognize her. That was the part that stayed with him afterward, that first fraction of a second where his brain refused to reconcile what his eyes were seeing. The woman who entered the conference room wore a charcoal blazer over dark slacks. Her natural hair pulled back in a way that was professional without trying too hard. She was mid-conversation with the man beside her, saying something low that made him nod, and she hadn't looked up yet. She was carrying a leather portfolio and a ceramic travel mug with a small paint smudge near the handle, and she moved through the room the way people move when they've stopped thinking about how they look in rooms. Then she looked up, and Adrian felt the floor do something strange beneath him. "Naomi," he said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. She stopped walking, not dramatically, just a single beat of stillness before she completed the last 2 steps to her chair and set her portfolio on the table. Her face had gone careful and composed in the way faces do when the person wearing it has prepared for this moment, maybe rehearsed it, maybe dreaded it. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "I'd heard Blackwell Holdings had acquired the primary stake. I assumed you'd send a representative. I lead our acquisitions personally." "I know." She pulled out her chair and sat. "So do I." The 2 attorneys who had been arranging documents along the far wall both found reasons to look at their papers. Adrian's assistant, Marcus, took a careful half-step backward. Nobody said anything for a moment that lasted entirely too long. Adrian sat down. He had not spoken to Naomi Carter in 8 years. The last time he'd seen her face had been through the window of a car outside the courthouse. She'd been standing on the steps in the rain, and he'd told himself not to look back. And he had looked back. And her expression had done something to him that he'd spent the better part of 8 years burying under work and decisions and forward motion. He'd buried it well. Most days it stayed buried. Today, it didn't. Should we address this? His attorney said quietly, leaning toward him. Or, no, Adrian said. We proceed with the negotiation. Naomi had already opened her portfolio. She uncapped a pen. Agreed, she said, without looking at him. Let's talk about the Meridian Project. They talked about the Meridian Project for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Naomi was good. That was the thing Adrian wasn't entirely ready for, though he supposed he should have been. She had always been sharp, sharper than the people around her usually gave her credit for, which had always been part of the problem. She argued her position on the development rights with a specificity that told him she had done her homework thoroughly, and she pushed back on 2 of his firm's structural proposals with counter-arguments that were technically sound and practically difficult to dismiss. There were moments when Adrian would make a point, and she would listen with her head slightly tilted, and then she would take apart exactly the weakest section of his argument and rebuild it in a direction that served her without ever being openly combative about it. She didn't perform her expertise. She just had it. He remembered that about her. The way she could walk into a room full of men who'd already decided she wasn't the smartest person present and make them quietly revise that assessment without giving them anything to bristle at. He'd fallen in love with that quality first, he thought, before he'd understood what it was. The pedestrian promenade design, Naomi said at one point, sliding a document across the table. Your firm's rendering places the commercial corridor along the water-facing perimeter, which I understand from a revenue standpoint, but it creates a visibility barrier that functionally privatizes what should be public waterfront access. The community benefit agreement we've drafted addresses that specifically. Adrian looked at the document. Relocating the commercial corridor moves projected revenue by approximately 12% in year 1. 9%, she corrected. We ran the numbers on foot traffic differential and they don't support 12. The long-term residential value offsets it within 18 months. One of his attorneys wrote something on his notepad. I'll have our team review the traffic analysis, Adrian said. We can share the full data set. She made a note. I'll have it sent by end of week. He watched her write and thought about how strange it was, how completely disorienting strange, to be sitting across a table from someone you'd once known in the way you only know a few people in a lifetime. He knew what she looked like when she was frustrated, and when she was genuinely laughing, and when she was trying not to cry. He knew that she'd been afraid of open water until she was 24 years old and had made herself learn to swim in the ocean on purpose, and that she'd always been a poor sleeper, and that she kept a sketchbook in whatever bag she was carrying. He knew these things, and she was sitting across a table from him, speaking in the measured, professional tone of someone who had made a deliberate choice not to know him at all. It was a specific kind of devastation. Welcome. The meeting concluded with a preliminary framework and a scheduled follow-up in 3 weeks. Hands were shaken, cards exchanged. Naomi shook Adrian's hand the same way she shook his attorney's hands. Firm, brief, zero eye contact beyond what courtesy required. She was halfway out the door when it happened. The door at the far end of the hall opened and the sound came first. Sneakers squeaking on tile, the collision of voices in the particular register of children who have been waiting somewhere boring for too long and are now finished waiting. Mom, 3 of them, all the same height, all wearing what appeared to be their school clothes with varying degrees of rumpling, all moving at the slightly too fast speed of boys who'd been told to walk but hadn't entirely committed to it. The one in front had already spotted Naomi and was talking before he'd fully reached her. Mrs. Patterson said we could leave early because the assembly got canceled and Darius's mom brought us, but Darius has soccer, so we didn't want to wait. Noah! Naomi had put a hand on his shoulder, and her voice was calm, but something in it had tightened. I have a meeting. You said it would be done by 3. It ran long. The 3 boys came to a collectively awkward stop beside her. Adrian had not moved. He was standing in the hallway outside the conference room, and he was looking at 3 8-year-old boys who were, he would not be able to explain later how he knew so immediately and completely, looking back at him with his own eyes. Not similar eyes. Not vaguely familiar eyes. His eyes. He'd seen them every morning in the mirror for 38 years. That particular shade of dark brown that ran generationally through the Blackwell men, paired with a very specific shape of brow that his own father had, that his grandfather had, that Adrian had, and that these 3 boys, all 3 of them, shared in a way that made the air feel strange. One of them, the tallest, who'd been the one talking, was looking at Adrian with naked curiosity and zero social filter. "Who are you?" he asked. "Noah," Naomi said, a quiet warning in her voice. "I'm just asking." Adrian opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Naomi, whose face had done something very controlled and very still, and he said nothing because there was nothing to say, and she looked back at him for just a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, and in those seconds something passed between them that had no language for it. An accounting, a reckoning, the specific recognition of a person who has been seen. "We'll discuss the traffic analysis when I receive it," she said. To her attorney, to anyone, not to him. She turned, gathered the boys with 2 small gestures, and walked toward the elevators. Adrian stood in the hallway and watched them go. Marcus appeared at his shoulder. "Car's downstairs." "Yeah," Adrian said. He didn't move for a moment. The elevator doors opened, and just before they closed, the one called Noah turned and looked back at him, openly, without embarrassment, the way a child looks at something they intend to figure out. The doors shut. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the study of his apartment with the lights on and did not read the 3 documents open on his desk, and did not pour a second drink and just turned it over and over in his mind. The math of it, the faces, the eyes he'd been looking at his entire life in his own reflection, now looking back at him from across a conference room hallway from the body of an 8-year-old child who said, with zero ceremony, "Who are you?" He had married Naomi Carter when he was 29 and she was 27. They had been together for 2 years before that. He had loved her in the imperfect, complicated way of a man who grew up being taught that love was a vulnerability and had not entirely unlearned that lesson, which meant he had loved her genuinely and also not well, not always, not with the consistency she deserved. The last year of the marriage had been the worst. The board of Blackwell Holdings had been at war with itself throughout most of it. Factions jostling for position ahead of his father's retirement, old alliances breaking apart, everyone watching who Adrian would align himself with and what it would signal. Victor Hale had been his closest friend on the board, his father's recommendation. The man who had known Adrian since he was 22 and had, in every visible way, consistently backed him. Victor had also been the one who brought Adrian the evidence. He hadn't called it evidence at the time. He'd called it concerns he'd heard from people he trusted, and he'd given them to Adrian carefully, in pieces, over the course of about 3 weeks. Naomi's meetings with Harrison Coyle, who sat on a competing real estate board. Phone records Adrian had never actually seen in full but been told about. A financial account and a name he didn't recognize that was allegedly connected to her. A suggestion, planted and tended like a slow-growing thing, that Naomi's independent work, her design projects, her consulting, might be something other than what it appeared. Adrian had not wanted to believe it, but he had been 30 years old and scared, in a way he hadn't admitted to anyone, that his father's legacy was going to collapse on his watch, and Victor had been patient and steady and sorrowful about the whole thing, and eventually the seed of doubt had grown into something Adrian couldn't see around. He'd confronted Naomi. The conversation had been brutal. She had been furious and devastated in a way that had looked to him, in his fear and his certainty, like guilt. He had said things he couldn't take back. She had said things that were the kind of true things people say when they've been backed against a wall and have nothing left to lose. He'd filed the papers 2 weeks later. He'd told himself she'd taken a settlement. He'd told himself she was fine. He'd told himself she had not been... He could barely finish the thought now. He'd told himself she had not been pregnant when he left, because he hadn't known. He turned that over now with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something that could cut. He hadn't known. He understood now, sitting in his lit study at 2:30 in the morning, that there was a version of the past 8 years, a version he was only beginning to see the shape of, in which not knowing was not innocent. He could have gone back. He could have asked. He could have questioned Victor's evidence with the skepticism he applied to everything else in his professional life. He had chosen not to because it had been easier to accept the narrative that released him from guilt, and that choice was its own kind of action, its own kind of harm. 3 boys with his eyes, 8 years old. He picked up his phone, he set it back down. He did not call anyone. The formal DNA test was something he handled through a private medical firm, quietly, using a standard paternity verification process that required only material already in a system he had legitimate access to from a past legal matter, a medical record from 8 years ago that had never been properly closed in the original divorce proceedings. He did not involve Naomi. He was not proud of that, but he needed to know before he said anything, because saying something without being certain would be the cruelest possible mistake. The results came back in 11 days. He read them twice. Then he sat with them for a long time without doing anything. The probability of paternity was listed at 99.97%, which in practice meant 100%, which in practice meant that Naomi Carter had been pregnant when he divorced her and had given birth to 3 children, triplets, 3 boys, who were biologically his sons, whom he had never met, whom he had not known existed, and who were now 8 years old and had looked at him in a hallway with his own face and asked, "Who are you?" He called Marcus and told him to clear his schedule for the next 2 weeks. Marcus, who had been his assistant for 6 years and had seen Adrian through a hostile board takeover, a federal regulatory review, and the death of his father, said only, "Are you all right?" Adrian thought about how to answer that. "No," he said, "but it doesn't matter right now." He started with the financial records. He still had access to certain archival files from the period of his father's original company restructuring, materials that had been locked in legal storage during the board transition and never fully reviewed. He had a forensic accountant he trusted, a woman named Patricia Glenn, who had done work for the firm during the regulatory audit 2 years prior. He called her and said he needed a confidential review. She came to his apartment rather than the office. What she found over the following 10 days began as unusual and became, piece by piece, damning. Victor Hale had been redirecting capital from Blackwell Holdings for at least 6 years before the divorce. A series of transactions so layered in shell companies and management fees and consulting agreements that they would have been almost impossible to trace without knowing specifically what to look for. Patricia was good at knowing what to look for. "Someone built this to survive surface-level review," she said one evening, spreading printed spreadsheets across Adrian's dining table. "The only reason it's visible at all now is because 2 of the shell entities got caught up in an unrelated SEC review 3 years ago and their records became public. Nobody connected them to Blackwell at the time." Adrian looked at a transaction dated 14 months before his divorce. A wire transfer to a holding company that, through 3 additional layers of incorporation, connected back to an account in Harrison Coyle's name. Harrison Coyle, the man Victor had told him Naomi was secretly meeting. "Victor needed those meetings to exist," Adrian said. "Not a question." "It looks that way," Patricia said carefully. The picture that was assembling itself in front of him was not subtle. Victor had been bleeding the company for years. Naomi, who had, by all accounts, been using her design work to independently review some of Blackwell's development projects at Adrian's request, had likely gotten close enough to the underlying financials to see something she wasn't supposed to see. That made her dangerous. The most efficient way to neutralize a threat was to discredit her first, and the most efficient way to discredit Naomi Carter was through the one person whose trust she needed most. Adrian had been used. He'd been handed a story that served someone else's interests, given just enough detail to make the narrative feel personal rather than orchestrated, and he'd swallowed it whole because he'd been afraid and because Victor Hale had, for his entire adult life, been someone he trusted without examination. He sat with that for a long time. He thought about all the ways he'd constructed the story afterward, the explanations he'd given himself for why it had happened, the versions of Naomi he'd imagined to make his choices feel less indefensible. He'd told himself she'd moved on. He'd told himself she was fine. He'd shaped the narrative to fit what he needed to live with, and the cost of that shaping had been paid entirely by someone else. Patricia was watching him carefully. "Adrian?" "I know," he said. "What do you want to do with this?" He looked at the documents on the table. He thought about 3 boys with his eyes. "Everything," he said. "I want to do everything." But said. The follow-up meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and Adrian arrived 12 minutes early. Naomi arrived exactly on time with the same attorney and a new stack of documents, including the traffic analysis she'd promised to send, and apparently decided to bring in person instead. She nodded once in his direction when she sat down. Professional. Contained. The expression of someone who had decided, as a matter of survival, not to let this table mean more than it was. They got through 40 minutes of productive negotiation before Adrian said, "Could we have the room for 10 minutes?" Naomi looked at him. "The principals," he said. "Just us." The attorneys and assistants exchanged the particular look of professionals who have learned not to express opinions about their clients' decisions. They filed out. The door closed. Naomi sat back in her chair and folded her hands on the table and said, "Whatever you want to say, please say it efficiently." "Are they mine?" Silence. "The boys," he said. "Noah and—" I didn't hear the other names. She was quiet for 4 full seconds. "Miles and Owen." He absorbed that. "Are they mine?" She looked at him in a way that was, behind all the careful stillness, the most exhausted thing he'd ever seen. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He'd expected it, and it still landed in his chest like something collapsing. "Why didn't you—" He stopped, started over. 8 years, Naomi." 8 years, she said quietly, "during which you signed papers calling me a fraud and a liar, and walked away without looking back. I'm going to need you to finish that sentence differently." He couldn't, because she was right. "I need you to know," he said carefully, "that what I believed at the time was not real. The evidence, Victor's account of your meetings with Coyle, all of it was manufactured, and I have proof." Something flickered in her face and then went flat again. "Okay." "Okay?" "Adrian." Her voice was measured, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. "Do you understand how many nights I spent in a hospital, alone because I had nobody, because I had walked away from everything to build a life with you, and you had burned it down? Do you understand how many nights I went over every possible version of what happened? I knew the evidence was wrong. I knew what I had and hadn't done. I've spent 8 years knowing that." She paused. "So, yes. Okay, you have proof. I'm glad you have proof, but I don't need your proof to know my own truth." He sat with that. "I want to know them," he said. "I understand if you say no. I understand if you need time. I understand that I have no standing here and nothing to offer that changes what happened." He looked at his hands on the table. "I'm not asking you to forgive anything or trust me or include me in your life. I'm asking to know my sons." She was quiet for a long time. "They don't know about you," she said finally. "What they know is that they have a mother who built them a life and a family that includes the people she chose. They know the rest is complicated." A pause. "Noah has been asking questions for 2 years. The weight of that, 2 years, settled on him. 'What do you need from me,' he said, 'to make this not another thing I get wrong?' She looked at him. He had the sense she was looking for something specific, checking for something, the way you look at a structure you've been told has been repaired to see if the repair is real or just paint over a crack. "I need you to be honest with them," she said. "No narrative management. No Billionaire with a charitable foundation version of the story. If they ask you a hard question, you answer it honestly, even when the honest answer makes you look exactly as bad as you actually were. All right? And I need you to understand that I will end this immediately, permanently, and without discussion if I see anything that suggests you are treating them as an extension of your ego rather than as people." "I understand." She nodded once. She picked up her pen and looked back down at her documents. "We'll finish the negotiation now," she said. They did. It took another hour. When Adrian stood to leave, she did not look up from her papers, and he did not ask her to. He walked to the elevator and stood inside it, looking at the floor numbers descend, and thought about a boy who had been asking questions for 2 years and did not yet know his father's name. The door opened on the lobby. Adrian walked out into the afternoon and stood on the pavement in the ordinary noise of the city and felt the specific, irreversible weight of a man who has finally seen clearly what he spent 8 years choosing not to look at. He flagged a cab. He had phone calls to make. The cab ride back to his office took 22 minutes, and Adrian spent all of it looking out the window without seeing anything. Marcus had left 3 messages. A real estate attorney in Singapore was waiting on a callback. The Meridian preliminary framework needed his signature before end of business. None of it felt like the same category of thing it had been that morning, when he'd walked into the conference room believing the most difficult part of his day would be a negotiation. He called Marcus back and said he'd handle the Singapore call in the morning. The framework? Tomorrow, Adrian said. Push everything. Marcus paused in the way he'd learned to pause when Adrian said something that was technically a request but was actually a statement. Done, he said, and hung up. Adrian looked out the window at the city sliding past and thought about Miles and Owen. He'd gotten Noah's name from Naomi in the conference room, but the other 2 had come through the door so fast, all 3 of them talking over each other, that he hadn't caught individual voices. Miles and Owen. He turned the names over. They were solid names, names that didn't apologize for themselves. He wanted to know who had chosen them. He suspected he knew. The phone calls he needed to make that week were not the easy kind. The first was to Patricia Glenn to discuss the scope of what she'd found and what it would take to turn private documentation into something legally actionable. The second was to a corporate attorney named Daniel Park, who had represented Blackwell Holdings during the regulatory review and was, in Adrian's estimation, the most methodical legal mind he knew. Daniel took the call on the second ring, which was unusual. Adrian explained in broad terms what he needed. There was a long silence on the other end. "You're talking about going after Victor Hale," Daniel said. "Yes." "Victor, who has been on the Blackwell board for 11 years and still holds a 17% stake." "Yes." "And your evidence is financial records from a forensic review you had done privately, without board knowledge." "And secondary documentation from the SEC filings I mentioned. Patricia can walk you through the structure." Adrian paused. "Is this something you can work with?" Another silence. Daniel was the kind of attorney who did not speak when he was thinking, which was something Adrian had always respected about him. "It's workable," Daniel said finally. "It's not fast. And it's going to create noise well before it creates resolution." "I know." "Adrian," a careful pause. "This is going to blow up the company, not permanently, but this is a significant disruption. You understand that?" "I understand that Victor has been stealing from the company for 6 years and used me to destroy someone's life in the process, and that I have been, in some part, complicit in that because I didn't ask the right questions when it mattered." His voice was level. "So yes, Daniel, I understand there will be noise." Daniel wrote something. Adrian could hear the scratch of it. "I'll need everything Patricia has. Original files, chain of custody documentation. Give me 2 weeks to build a preliminary picture." "You have it." He hung up and sat in the cab for the remaining 4 blocks thinking about the word complicit and the particular discomfort of applying it to yourself. He didn't reach out to Naomi again for 9 days. He'd meant to wait longer. Had told himself he would wait until the legal groundwork was more established, until he had something concrete to offer rather than just the hollow weight of what he now knew. But on the 9th day, his phone buzzed at 7:40 in the evening with a text from a number he didn't have saved, and the message read, "Noah found your name in the Meridian project brief. He's been looking you up for 2 days. I thought you should know before he asks me directly, and I have to decide what to say." Adrian read it twice. Then he typed back, "What do you need from me?" The response came 3 minutes later. "Nothing yet. I just needed you to know the clock has started." He set the phone on the counter and stood in his kitchen and thought about an 8-year-old boy with his eyes sitting somewhere looking at search results for Adrian Blackwell, trying to assemble a picture from publicly available information of a man who was, in ways the internet could not explain, his father. The clock has started. He thought he understood what that meant. It meant Naomi had been managing this story with great care for 8 years, and she was now at the edge of the version she'd built, watching it approach the moment where it would need to change. And she was telling him because the change would involve him whether she wanted it to or not. He typed, "When you're ready, I'd like to suggest a neutral space. Somewhere low pressure. whatever makes the most sense for them. The reply came an hour later, just 3 words. I'll think about it. He took that. Victor Hale called him on a Friday morning, which was the first sign that something was moving. Victor had been careful over the years to maintain the appearance of a collegial relationship. Lunches twice a year, occasional messages about board business, the practiced warmth of a man who had learned to maintain proximity to people he'd used because proximity was easier to manage than distance. Adrian had returned the lunches and the messages with equivalent care because he had not, until 10 days ago, understood fully what he was looking at. "You canceled the Singapore call," Victor said. "Nguyen's people reached out to me directly. I pushed it to next week. It's not urgent. Also, the quarterly review is Thursday, and I haven't received your prepared remarks. I'll have them by Wednesday." A pause. Victor's pauses were different from Daniel's. Where Daniel was silent because he was thinking, Victor was silent in the way of a man listening for something specific in the gaps of what you said. "Are you all right? You seem... I'm dealing with a project complication, nothing that affects the quarter." Adrian kept his voice even. "How's Rebecca?" The question landed the way it was designed to, as a signal of normalcy, of nothing unusual, of a man asking after a friend's wife, because that was the ordinary texture of a collegial relationship. Victor accepted it. They talked for 4 more minutes about nothing that mattered, and then Victor said he'd see him Thursday, and they hung up. Adrian put the phone down and felt, for the first time in this process, something that was not grief or guilt or the slow burn of recognition, but something sharper and colder. Anger. Not the quick, hot kind that passes in an hour, the other kind, the kind that settles into the body and becomes a kind of clarity. The first time he saw the boys again was a Saturday, 3 weeks after the conference room. Naomi had agreed to a public space, a large community park near her office that the boys apparently visited regularly on weekends. She had told Noah only that a man she knew from work would be stopping by briefly. She had told him no more than that, and she had not told Miles or Owen anything at all because Owen was, by her account, still too young to manage anticipation without questions, and Miles would reason through it within minutes and arrive at conclusions she wasn't ready for him to have yet. Adrian arrived before them and sat on a bench near the open field where a weekend soccer pickup game was in progress. He dressed deliberately without thinking about it too hard. Ordinary clothes, nothing that announced itself. He had a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He saw them from 50 yards away. They came around the path from the parking area. Naomi in front, slightly to the left, saying something to the boy at her elbow, while the other two moved ahead at the speed children naturally default to when they're transitioning from car to open space. They were wearing similar jackets, but not identical ones. Their heights were identical. The way they moved was subtly different. He could see it even at a distance, the particular rhythm each boy had when he walked. He stood up. Naomi saw him and something went through her expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of readiness. She said something to the boys and they slowed. Noah had spotted him. Adrian recognized the look, the same unguarded directness from the conference room hallway. This kid did not do subtle assessment. He looked at things until he understood them. "Hi," Noah said, about 4 feet away. "Hi," Adrian said. The other two had flanked their brother in the unconscious way of children who have grown up together and process new situations as a unit. The one on Noah's right was watching Adrian with an expression that was careful and analytical in a way that made Adrian feel briefly like he was being evaluated. The one on the left was looking at Adrian and then at his mother and then at Adrian again with a kind of open, uncomplicated curiosity that was somehow the most disarming thing in the group. Naomi said, "Noah, Miles, Owen, this is Mr. Blackwell." "From the project," Noah said. "Yes." "You're the one building the waterfront thing with Mom." "We're negotiating it," Adrian said, "still working out the details." Miles spoke for the first time. His voice was quieter than Noah's, more contained. "Are you the same Blackwell as Blackwell Holdings?" Something shifted in Naomi's posture. "Yes," Adrian said. "You're the CEO." "I am." Miles looked at his mother. Something passed between them that Adrian couldn't fully read. Naomi's face steady, Miles's expression giving nothing away. Then Miles looked back at Adrian and said, "Okay," in a tone that clearly meant the assessment was ongoing. Owen said, "Do you like soccer?" It was so completely off the established conversational register that Adrian laughed. A real laugh, short and surprised. "I played in high school," he said. "I was decent." "We could use a defender," Owen said seriously. "The game's starting in like 5 minutes." "Owen," Naomi said. "What? We need a defender." Adrian looked at Naomi. She met his eyes with an expression that was very briefly something close to unwilling amusement. "I'm in terrible shape," Adrian said to Owen. "I'll embarrass you." "That's okay," Owen said, already turning toward the field. "Everyone else is bad too." He played 35 minutes of the worst soccer of his adult life. He was slow and out of position and twice misread the ball completely and found himself chasing it in the wrong direction, while Owen, who was small and extremely fast, cut past him with no apparent effort. Miles played with a kind of calm, precise economy that suggested he understood the geometry of the game even if his legs hadn't caught up to his mind yet. Noah was everywhere, loud, enthusiastic, frequently in the wrong place at the right time in a way that somehow worked. At halftime, Owen sat next to him on the grass. "Pretty bad," Owen said. "I told you. But you didn't stop. Some of the dads just kind of jog around and don't really try." Adrian looked at him. "Some of the dads? From school and stuff?" Owen pulled at the grass. "Mom doesn't usually bring people to soccer." A beat. Adrian chose his words carefully. "I appreciate her making an exception." Owen seemed to consider this. Then he said, without particular weight, "Are you going to come back?" The question was so direct and so undefended that it took Adrian a moment to answer. "I hope so," he said. "If your mom thinks it's okay." Owen nodded like this was a reasonable answer and stood up. "Miles says you're probably important," he said. "Miles thinks everyone who works with Mom is trying to take something." Adrian sat with that. "Miles is smart to be careful," he said. Owen shrugged. "Miles is careful about everything." He ran back onto the field. Naomi was sitting on the bench when Adrian walked back to collect his coffee, which had gone completely cold. She was watching the boys on the field. "Owen told me Miles thinks I'm trying to take something," Adrian said. "Miles told me the same thing this morning when I explained you were coming." A pause. "I didn't argue with him." "That's fair." She was quiet for a moment. On the field, Noah attempted a shot that went wide by 6 feet, and he threw his arms out as if arguing with physics. Naomi's mouth moved, almost a smile. "He's been asking," she said. "Noah. He's been asking since he was 6, but it's gotten more specific lately." She didn't look at Adrian when she said this. "He started noticing that other kids had fathers who showed up to things, and he started asking why his didn't. I gave him answers that were true, but incomplete, and for a while that held. It's not holding anymore." "What does he know?" "He knows his father is someone I was married to before he was born. He knows it ended badly. He knows I don't talk about it because it's painful, which he respects because he's a decent kid, even when he's being relentless." She paused. "He doesn't know your name. He didn't connect the brief on my desk to anything until this week. And when he does connect it, he will ask me directly because that's who he is." She finally looked at Adrian. "And I will tell him the truth, which means I need to know what you intend to do, because I'm not going to construct a story around a man who disappears in 6 months. Adrian held her gaze. "I'm not disappearing." "You say that now." "I know." He looked at his hands. "I understand you have no reason to take me at my word on anything. I understand the only evidence I can offer is time, and I don't have any accumulated yet." He paused. "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to let me start accumulating it." The soccer game resumed on the field. Owen's voice rose in celebration from somewhere near the left goal. Naomi said, "There's a science fair in 3 weeks. Miles has been working on a project about material stress in building structures." A deliberate pause. "He hasn't asked anyone to come, but if someone happened to be there, he wouldn't tell me it bothered him." Adrian understood what she wasn't quite saying. "I'll be there." "Don't make a thing of it," she said. Just be there. The science fair was held in the gymnasium of an elementary school that smelled like floor wax and cafeteria pizza. Adrian arrived 12 minutes after it opened because he'd decided that arriving before it opened would be too much, and arriving late would be a message he didn't intend. And so he'd calibrated to 12 minutes, which now seemed slightly insane as a thought process, but was the kind of thing you did when every choice felt significant. Miles's project was near the center row. The boards were covered in technical drawings that were, for an 8-year-old, startling in their precision. Small annotations, accurately rendered cross-sections of structural joints, a materials comparison chart that had been built from an actual experiment using small-scale models Miles had constructed by hand. Adrian stood in front of it for a moment before Miles noticed him. The boy's expression when he turned and found Adrian standing there reading his work was extremely controlled. If he was surprised, he didn't show it. "You came," he said. "You don't mind?" Miles looked at him with the particular flatness of a child who had decided to reserve judgment. "Mom said you might. She told me about the project." Adrian looked back at the boards. "The material stress analysis? You built these models yourself?" "My teacher said I could use the design lab after school." Miles came to stand beside him, still cautious, but something in his posture had shifted slightly toward the professional. The hypothesis was that the joint type matters more than the material in lateral load distribution, but the results were more complicated than that. "What did you find?" Miles looked at his board and began explaining, carefully at first, testing whether Adrian was actually listening or just performing attention. And as it became clear Adrian was following, his explanations grew more detailed, more technical, more genuinely engaged. He had his mother's clarity of thought, Adrian noticed. The same quality of organizing a complex idea and presenting it in sequential pieces that didn't lose the through line. A nearby parent drifted past, glanced at Miles's board, and said vaguely, "Very nice, sweetheart," and kept walking. Miles watched them go with the resigned expression of someone accustomed to being underestimated by adults who didn't look closely enough. "That joint failure model in the third section," Adrian said. "Have you considered testing it under rotational load rather than just lateral? The interaction effect might give you different distribution results." Miles turned to look at him. "My firm does a lot of high-rise development," Adrian said. "Wind load analysis is a significant part of our engineering review process." Something shifted in Miles's face. The careful neutrality didn't go away entirely, but behind it something lit up. "The rotational component would require a different testing apparatus," he said. "It would. Do you have access to one?" "No." A pause. "But I could build one." Adrian looked at the work on the board. "I think you could," he said. Miles held his gaze for a moment. Something was being calculated behind those eyes. Adrian could see it happening, the same methodical processing he'd recognized the first day. "My mom says you have reasons for being here that she's still figuring out," Miles said. Not accusatory, just a statement of recorded fact. Adrian had promised Naomi honest answers to hard questions. "That's true," he said. "Are the reasons good?" He thought about how to answer that, really thought about it, because this kid would know if he was reaching for the easy version. "I think they're real," he said finally. "Whether they're good enough is something I'm trying to work out." Miles considered this for 3 full seconds. Then he looked back at his project board. "The rotational apparatus would need a fixed pivot base," he said. "I've been thinking about the geometry." "What have you come up with?" Miles started explaining. Adrian listened. Noah found out on a Sunday afternoon in late October. It didn't happen the way Naomi had planned. She'd told Adrian she was going to sit with Noah the following weekend, when the boys were out of school and she had time to do it properly. But Noah had apparently done his own research in the interim, working from the name he'd seen in the project brief, cross-referencing photos he found on a business news site, and arriving at his own conclusion in the particular unstoppable way of a child who has decided to know something. He came to Naomi while she was working at her drafting table, and he stood in the doorway and said, "The man at the park and the science fair is my dad." Naomi set down her pen. She turned her chair. "Sit down, Noah." He sat in the chair across from her desk that the boys used when they came to her with things. His expression was doing several things at once. There was the brightness of having figured something out, and underneath it, at a depth he wasn't fully hiding, something rawer and less comfortable. Naomi told him the truth. She told it carefully, in the version appropriate for an 8-year-old. Not all of it, not the financial fraud, not the full scope of the betrayal, but the honest bones of it. That she and Adrian had been married, and it had ended badly, and she hadn't known she was pregnant when it happened. That she had chosen to build their life independently because she hadn't believed at the time that the circumstances allowed for anything else. That she still had serious reservations about what the future looked like, but that she was trying to give Adrian the opportunity to be present if he was willing to do it right. Noah listened to all of this without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did he know about us?" "No," Naomi said. "He didn't know." "Why didn't you tell him?" A hard question, honestly put. "Because when I found out I was pregnant, the situation between us was very bad, and I had real reasons to believe that bringing him into your lives before I'd built something stable would cause more harm than good." She paused. "I could have been wrong about that. I'm still not entirely sure." Noah sat with this. Is he going to keep coming around? He wants to. I'm watching to see if he actually does it. What's the difference? Wanting something and doing it are two different things, she said. I'm waiting to see which one he is. Noah looked at his hands in his lap. He had a habit of folding his fingers together when he was processing something difficult. She'd noticed it when he was about 4 years old, and it had never gone away. He seemed like he was actually listening to Miles, Noah said finally, at the science fair. Miles told me about the rotational thing. I know. Miles doesn't usually talk to people about his projects. He thinks most people are just being polite. Naomi said nothing. I'm not saying it's okay, Noah said. I'm just saying I noticed. She looked at her son, this fierce, curious, direct child who had come into the world in the most difficult circumstances she'd ever survived and had somehow grown into the kind of person who noticed things and said them plainly. Neither am I, she said. Noticing isn't the same as deciding. He nodded. He unfolded his hands and stood up. He paused at the doorway. Can I talk to him? Noah asked. By myself. Not at a soccer game or a science fair. Just, talk. Naomi looked at her oldest son, who was 8 years old and already asking for what he needed without apology. I'll arrange it, she said. Victor called Adrian again the following Tuesday. This time the call was less casual. He'd heard through a contact Adrian didn't recognize that Patricia Glenn had been retained for some kind of financial review. He framed it as concern. I just want to make sure if there's anything irregular surfacing, the board is looped in, he said. You know how these things can look if they come out sideways. It's a routine review, Adrian said. Patricia does this work for us periodically. Victor's voice was doing the careful thing. Anything I should know about? I'll have the board updated when there's something concrete to discuss. A pause that lasted just a beat too long. Of course, Victor said. Good to know. He hung up. Adrian sat with the phone in his hand. The call had lasted 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes something had changed in the atmosphere between them. Thin, barely perceptible, like the pressure drop before weather. Victor knew something was moving. He didn't know what yet, but he knew. Daniel Park called an hour later. We're ready to file, he said. I want to walk you through the federal component before we move, but the documentation is solid. Patricia's work is thorough. How solid? Solid enough that the outcome isn't really in question. The timeline is. A pause. Victor is going to have advance warning through his network. He has people everywhere. I know. He's going to move to protect himself before the filing is public. What does that mean practically? Daniel was quiet for a moment. I don't know yet. It means we need to be watching. Adrian thought about 3 boys who didn't know what was coming. He thought about a company Naomi had built from nothing, a boutique firm that had grown into something real and significant, something she'd constructed out of the wreckage of what he'd participated in destroying. How quickly can we move once we file? He asked. Once the federal component is engaged, Victor's access to company assets gets frozen within 72 hours. Then file as soon as you're ready. Adrian, I know what I'm doing, Daniel. Another silence. Okay, Daniel said. End of week. The conversation with Noah happened on a Wednesday evening. Naomi had arranged it without ceremony. Adrian arrived at a small coffee place near her office that she'd chosen specifically because it was quiet on weekday evenings, and because she could sit 2 tables away and read documents while still being in the room. It was not subtle, but it was honest, and Adrian respected it. Noah arrived with Naomi, spotted Adrian at the table, and walked over with the same directness he applied to everything. I looked you up, Noah said, pulling out the chair across from Adrian. I figured you might. You're pretty famous. In a narrow context. Noah looked at him with the frank appraisal that seemed to be his default mode. He had Naomi's cheekbones and Adrian's eyes and a way of sitting that was neither of them. Some combination that was entirely his own. My mom said you didn't know, Noah said. About us? That's right. How did you find out? I saw you in the hallway outside the conference room. I noticed. He paused, picking the words carefully because this was a child and the words mattered. I noticed that you looked like me. And after that, I made sure. Noah absorbed this. What did you do when you found out? I sat with it for a while, Adrian said. Then I called a lawyer. Why a lawyer? Because there are some things that are wrong that need to be fixed through legal processes, and I needed to understand what that looked like. Noah tipped his head. Are you fixing them? I'm trying to. Are you going to tell me what they are? When you're older, yes, completely. For now, there are people who did things that hurt your mother and hurt this family, and I'm working to make sure they're held accountable for it. Noah considered this with the seriousness it was offered in. Are you doing it because it's the right thing, or because you want us to like you? The question was so precisely aimed that Adrian felt it land somewhere true. Both, he said. I think it's the right thing, and I also won't pretend that it doesn't matter to me what you think. He looked at Noah steadily. But the first one would be true, even if you never wanted to see me again. Noah held his gaze for a long moment. Miles thinks you're okay, he said. Miles doesn't think most people are okay. I gathered that. Owen already likes you, but Owen likes most people, so. Noah shrugged. That's different. Adrian waited. Noah looked down at the table, then back up. I don't know what I think yet, he said. I just wanted to tell you that. I don't know. That's fair, Adrian said. You don't have to know yet. Are you going to keep coming to stuff? Yes. Even if it's weird? Especially then. Something in Noah's expression shifted. Not resolved, not decided, but present. He picked up the hot chocolate Naomi had apparently pre-ordered for him and took a sip and said, Miles is doing a new version of the stress project. He wants to build the rotational thing you talked about. I heard. He's going to need materials. The school doesn't have some of the stuff. Adrian looked at him. Tell him I can help with that. Noah nodded. He drank his hot chocolate. 2 tables away, Naomi turned a page in her document without looking up. The 3 of them sat in that small, quiet coffee shop on a Wednesday evening. Not yet a family, not strangers anymore. Something unnamed and fragile and real between them that none of them had words for yet. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary evening. Traffic, voices. The low hum of a place that didn't know or care that something was beginning here, slowly and imperfectly, inside a window seat at a table for 2 that had somehow fit 3. Daniel filed on a Friday. Adrian knew the moment it went through because his phone started ringing within the hour. Board members who'd gotten wind through their attorneys, a financial journalist at a wire service who somehow already had the broad strokes, and then Victor himself. At 11:47 in the morning, calling from a number Adrian didn't recognize. Adrian let it go to voicemail. Victor did not leave one. The filing was not yet public in the way that news becomes public. It was in the system, moving through the initial federal intake process. But the supporting documentation Patricia had built and the secondary SEC materials Daniel had attached made it substantial enough that the relevant agencies would not sit on it. Daniel had told him to expect 48 to 72 hours before the first inquiries began hitting Blackwell Holdings' legal department from the outside. What Adrian had not anticipated was how fast Victor's network would move internally. By 3 in the afternoon, he had received calls from 4 board members, all of them using variations of the same language. Concerns, process, proper channels, getting ahead of this together. And all of them in the particular way of people who have decided which way a thing is falling, angling their concern in the direction of the person who had filed rather than the person being filed against. Marcus came to the doorway of Adrian's office at 3:40. "Victor's here," he said. "He doesn't have an appointment." Adrian looked up from the documents on his desk. "Send him in." Victor Hale was 61 years old and had the build of a man who had once been athletic and had since replaced muscle with a kind of settled authority that occupied space just as effectively. He came through the door without the social warm-up he usually employed and sat in the chair across from Adrian's desk and looked at him with an expression that had dropped the collegial warmth entirely. "You filed with the DOJ," Victor said. "My attorney filed on my behalf." "On the basis of what Patricia Glenn found." "On the basis of what the SEC filings established and what Patricia's review confirmed." Victor was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, 41 floors down, the city was doing its ordinary afternoon things, indifferent to the 2 men in this room. "Adrian he said, and his voice had shifted into something that was supposed to sound like disappointed reason. "You are making a very significant mistake based on an incomplete picture." "I've seen the wire transfers, Victor. Those transactions have explanations that your forensic accountant doesn't have context for." "Then you'll have the opportunity to present that context to the Department of Justice." Victor looked at him. The disappointed reason expression was losing its surface tension. Underneath it was something harder and less curated, and seeing the thing that had been behind all those years of lunches and managed conversations and carefully placed seeds of doubt, produced in Adrian a feeling that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief, but some blunt mixture of both. "You were a mess," Victor said. "When your father handed you the company, you were 30 years old and running scared, and you needed someone to help you hold it together. I did that." "You did," Adrian said. "And while you were doing it, you were stealing from the company, and you used my marriage to cover your tracks when Naomi got close enough to see it." "Naomi was careful," Adrian said, quietly. Victor stopped. Something moved through his expression. "The documentation is filed," Adrian said. "My attorney is prepared for whatever countermeasures you intend to pursue. The board will be formally notified by end of business today." He stood, which was a decision about the shape of the conversation going forward. "I'd recommend you speak to your own attorney before you say anything else in this room." Victor stood too. He was a physically larger man, and he used that for a moment, the way men do when the words have stopped working. "You're going to lose everything," Victor said. "Some of it," Adrian said, "not the parts that matter." Victor left. Adrian sat back down and looked at his desk and waited for his hands to stop being unsteady, which took about 90 seconds, and then he called Daniel and told him the meeting had happened. "Good," Daniel said. "That means he's scared. He's going to move fast. We expected that. The asset freeze motion is already queued. If he tries to liquidate anything through the shell network, we'll see it within hours." A pause. "How are you?" Adrian thought about the question. Outside his window, the city was orange with late afternoon. "I'm fine," he said. "Let's keep moving." Naomi didn't hear about the filing from Adrian. She heard about it from her attorney, Renata Cruz, who called her on Friday evening while she was making dinner and said, in the careful voice of someone delivering information of unclear valence, that there appeared to be a significant federal filing against a board member of Blackwell Holdings involving financial fraud, and that Naomi's name appeared in the supporting documentation as a witness to certain financial discrepancies. Naomi turned off the stove. She stood in her kitchen and listened to Renata explain what she knew, which wasn't everything. And when Renata finished, she said, "I need to read the filing. I'm sending it now." She put the boys in front of a movie, some animated thing Owen had been requesting for 2 weeks, and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and read. It took her 40 minutes. Some of it she already knew in the way you know things you've spent years turning over from the inside. The manufactured evidence, the coil connection, the particular shape of a betrayal she'd been able to see but never prove. Some of it was new. The scale of the financial fraud, the specificity of Victor's network, the documented timeline of how it had been built, layer by layer, years before she'd ever come close enough to any of it to be a problem. The supporting documentation included a section on the forged evidence used in the divorce proceedings. Reading her own name in a federal filing, described as the subject of a deliberate and coordinated campaign of defamation, produced a feeling she couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't vindication exactly. It was more like standing in a room you'd been locked out of for 8 years and finally having someone officially confirm that the door had been locked from the outside. She had always known the door was locked from the outside. Knowing it officially was a different kind of weight. She closed the laptop. She sat in the kitchen for a few minutes, listening to the movie sounds coming from the living room. Owen laughing at something, the lower murmur of Miles asking Noah a question. Then she picked up her phone and called Adrian. He answered on the second ring. "You filed," she said. "Yes." "You didn't tell me." "I was going to call tonight. I wanted the formal notification to go to your attorney first so you had the documentation before you heard it from me." She sat with that. It was, she acknowledged to herself, a thoughtful sequencing. It didn't entirely offset the fact that this was a filing that involved her name and her history, and he had moved it forward without telling her, but she understood the logic of it. "My name is in there," she said, "as a witness to financial discrepancies and a target of the defamation campaign. You are not a subject of the investigation. You are, in the documentation's framing, someone who was harmed." "I know how to read a filing, Adrian." "I know you do." A pause. "I should have told you I was filing before it happened. That was my mistake." She appreciated that he said it directly. "Yes," she said. "It was." "I'm sorry." She looked at her kitchen wall. 8 years ago, she had sat in a hospital room alone, and she had said his name out loud to a room that had nobody in it, not because she'd expected an answer, but because the weight of everything had needed somewhere to go. She had said it once and then she had stopped, and she had not let herself say it again for a very long time. "The boys are going to hear about this," she said, "if it goes public, which it will." "I know, I've been thinking about that. Noah especially, he's been looking you up. He's going to find this." "Do you want me to talk to them?" She was quiet for a moment. On the other end of the phone, she could hear the ambient quiet of wherever he was. His apartment, she assumed, the kind of spare silence of a large space occupied by one person. "Not yet," she said. "Let me see how it unfolds. Some of this they don't need to carry. I'll follow your lead." "I know you will," she said. And then, before she'd entirely decided to say it, "Thank you for doing it." A pause on his end. "I should have done it years ago." "You couldn't have," she said. "You didn't know what you were looking for." Another pause. "That's different from saying it was okay. It's just true." "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's true." They stayed on the phone for another moment without either of them saying anything, which was its own kind of conversation. Then Naomi said goodnight and put the phone on the table and went back into the living room and sat between Miles and Owen on the couch and watched the last 30 minutes of the animated movie, while Owen pressed against her side and Miles watched the screen with the contained attentiveness he brought to everything. The story broke publicly on a Monday. A financial news outlet ran it first. Blackwell Holdings board member faces federal fraud inquiry, and within 4 hours it had been picked up by 2 national papers and a business network. The coverage was accurate in its broad strokes and somewhat fevered in its framing, the way business journalism gets when it involves old money and boardroom drama and numbers with enough zeros to function as spectacle. Victor's name was prominent, so was Adrian's, as the one who had initiated the filing. The reporting noted, in most versions, that Adrian Blackwell had taken the unusual step of filing against a member of his own board, and that the supporting documentation alleged a years-long pattern of financial fraud and internal misconduct that had been concealed through shell company structures. 3 board members released statements expressing support for a full investigation. 2 released statements expressing concern about the process. Victor's attorney released a statement denying all allegations and promising to demonstrate that the filing was motivated by internal corporate politics. Adrian read all of it at his desk on Monday morning and thought about how strange it was to be the subject of a news cycle. His life had been adjacent to news cycles before. Blackwell Holdings was a significant enough company that its transactions and leadership changes made business pages, but this was different. This was his name attached to a narrative of institutional betrayal and personal history that the people writing it only partially understood, and the partial understanding was somehow worse than ignorance. His phone rang at 9:15. He looked at the screen. An unfamiliar number with a coastal area code that he recognized as the one near Naomi's office. He answered. "Mr. Blackwell." A young voice, slightly formal with effort. "This is Noah." Adrian sat up straighter without meaning to. "Noah. Hi. I saw the news." No preamble, no softening. "About your company and Victor Hale." "Okay. Is that what you meant when you said there were people who did things that needed to be held accountable?" Adrian chose his words the way he'd promised himself he would. "Yes. That's part of it." A pause. The article said he used evidence against someone to cover up the money stuff. It didn't say who. "That's not something I can discuss in full with you yet, but I want you to know that when you're old enough to hear all of it, I will tell you everything, and I won't make myself look better than I was in it." Another pause. Longer. "Were you the one the evidence was used against, or were you the one who used it?" The question landed like something thrown from a height. Adrian breathed. "I'm the one who was deceived into using it," he said, "which means I hurt someone who didn't deserve it because I believed something that wasn't true." Silence on Noah's end. "The someone," Noah said slowly, "is my mom." "Yes." The line was quiet for so long that Adrian checked the connection. "She built this whole company," Noah said finally. "After." "I know." "By herself." "I know that too." "She never told us it was because of that. She just said she built it because she wanted to." A pause that had something complicated in it. "I think she didn't want us to think of it as something that happened to her." Adrian felt the weight of that settle on him. He didn't try to respond immediately because there was no response adequate to it. "She's the best person I know," Noah said, not defiantly, just as a fact being entered into evidence. "She is," Adrian said, without qualification. Noah seemed to sit with this, then, "Okay." The word doing the work of something much larger. "I'm going to go. I called from the school office and I have class." "Thank you for calling, Noah." "Yeah." A brief pause. "You should come to the game on Saturday. We're playing Riverside. Miles says we're going to lose, but Owen thinks we're going to win, and I think both of them are wrong." Adrian's chest did something complicated and quiet. "I'll be there," he said. "Okay," Noah said, and hung up. The asset freeze came through on Wednesday, 48 hours ahead of Daniel's projected timeline, which meant Victor's attorneys had pushed for emergency review and lost. It was, in practical terms, the moment the walls closed. Any movement of funds through the shell network was now flagged and subject to seizure, and Victor's ability to protect himself financially was severely constrained. What Adrian had not anticipated was what Victor did instead. On Thursday morning, Naomi's office received a registered letter from an attorney representing a newly formed entity called Coastal Development Partners, alleging that CNC Development Group had used improperly acquired proprietary architectural designs in two of its most significant projects over the past 3 years. The allegation was accompanied by technical documentation that was, superficially, plausible, enough so that Renata Cruz called Naomi immediately and told her to pause any public-facing project announcements until they'd had time to assess. By Thursday afternoon, 2 of CNC's institutional investors had reached out expressing concern. By Friday morning, the story had appeared in a trade publication framed as an ongoing dispute, and 2 government project partners had quietly asked for update calls. Naomi sat in her office on Friday afternoon and looked at the wall and felt the particular nausea of watching something you have built, carefully, expensively, at enormous personal cost, begin to shake. She called Renata first. "How serious is the documentation?" It's constructed well enough to create doubt, Renata said, but the actual design records will refute it if we can get through the standard discovery process. The problem is timeline. That process takes months, and the investor pressure is happening now. Victor's doing this. Almost certainly. It's a pressure move. He doesn't need to win the allegation. He needs to create enough uncertainty to damage your standing while his main case is being contested. Naomi looked at her desk. On it was a framed photograph her assistant had placed there years ago. The three boys at the opening of CNC's first major project. Miles in a hard hat 3 sizes too large. Owen waving at the camera. Noah with his hand on his hip in a pose he'd clearly borrowed from watching her on job sites. "What do I need to fight this?" she said. "Your original design files, time-stamped and authenticated. Affidavits from your design team, and any outside consultants who worked on the projects. And time." "How much time?" "More than you probably want to hear." She ended the call. She sat for another moment, then she picked up her phone and called Adrian. She didn't preface it. "Victor is going after my company," she said. "I know. Daniel called me an hour ago. His team picked up the filing. This is because of your federal action." "Yes." No deflection. "He's trying to create leverage. If he can destabilize CNC, he has something to negotiate with." "My company is not your negotiating chip." "I know that. I built CNC without you. I built it without any of this. It is not a casualty of your boardroom war, Adrian." "I hear you." His voice was steady. "I need you to hear me for a moment. The documentation he's filed is fabricated the same way the divorce evidence was fabricated. Daniel's team has already begun the process of establishing that. We can move to have the allegation dismissed on those grounds, and we can do it faster than a standard discovery process because the fabrication connects directly to the existing federal case." Naomi was quiet. "I need your design records," he said. "Original files, creation timestamps, anything that establishes the timeline of your work predating his claim." Renata said the same thing. Renata's right. If we can submit them through the federal framework as evidence of Victor's broader pattern, fabricated evidence as a consistent method, it accelerates the dismissal significantly. She pressed 2 fingers to her forehead. This was the thing she had spent 8 years constructing her life to avoid. The position of needing something from him, of having her world entangled with his in ways that required her to accept his help. "I don't like this," she said. "I know." A pause. "I'm not asking you to like it. I'm asking you to let me fix one of the things I broke." She was quiet for a long moment. "I'll have Renata coordinate with Daniel," she said finally. "The files will be ready Monday." "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she said. "This is not a favor. This is you cleaning up damage that originated with you." "Yes," he said. "It is." The Saturday soccer game was played on a field that had been rained on the night before and was accordingly soft and uneven, which Noah had predicted with a pessimism that turned out to be unfounded because Riverside's team was worse at wet field play than CNC's boys, and the game ended in a narrow, scrappy, completely inelegant win that Owen celebrated as though they'd qualified for something international. Adrian was on the sideline with about 20 other parents, and an older man he eventually gathered was the father of one of Noah's teammates. The man had the comfortable posture of someone who had been standing on soccer sidelines for years, coffee in hand, minimal reaction to the play, occasional murmured comment to whoever was beside him. He'd introduced himself partway through the first half. Gerald. His son was the goalkeeper. "You knew?" Gerald asked, not unkindly. "To the team, yeah." "Which one's yours?" Adrian looked at the field. The question was so ordinary, "Which one's yours?" and answering it for the first time in public produced a feeling he hadn't prepared for. "3 of them," he said. "The 3 identical ones." Gerald looked at the field and then back at Adrian. "The triplets?" "Yes." "Huh." He sipped his coffee. "I've been on this sideline for 2 years, first time I've seen their father." He said it without particular judgment, which somehow made it worse than if there'd been judgment in it. "Yeah," Adrian said. "First time." Gerald nodded. He went back to watching the game. He didn't ask any follow-up questions, which Adrian found he was grateful for. On the field, Owen had gotten the ball near the right corner and was trying to cut inside with a move that was more ambition than execution, and he lost it to a Riverside defender and threw his hands up in frustration before immediately recovering and sprinting back to position. The speed of that recovery, the frustration moving through him and then letting go, because the game was still happening and that mattered more than the mistake, was something Adrian watched twice in his mind. Miles, 2 yards away, had already anticipated the turnover and repositioned. Noah was already talking, organizing, pointing people into place. 3 distinct people, 3 entirely different ways of being in the world, and somehow all 3 of them his. And he was standing on a wet sideline on a Saturday morning watching them and feeling the full, particular weight of all the Saturdays that had happened without him. After the game, when the boys were red-faced and loud with the specific energy of children who have just won something physical, Owen ran to him first. "Did you see the second goal?" Owen said. "I saw it. That was mostly me." "Mostly?" "Noah passed it, but I finished it." Owen was still breathing hard. "The finish is the important part." "That's genuinely debatable," Miles said, appearing at his brother's shoulder, "from both a contribution and an aesthetic standpoint." "You scored on a rebound," Noah said, arriving last, tugging at his muddy jersey, "which barely counts." "A goal counts," Miles said. "The method is irrelevant to the scoreboard." They were all talking at once now, to each other and to Adrian and to the general air, and he stood in the middle of it and let it happen. This ordinary loud argument about soccer goals between 3 boys who had grown up in a family he hadn't been part of, and he thought about something Naomi had said that first day in the conference room. "I lead our acquisitions personally." She had built everything personally. The company, the family, the framework inside which these 3 boys understood the world. She had done it from scratch, in a city where she'd known no one, with 3 infants and a destroyed marriage and a reputation that had been deliberately burned. And still, somehow, Noah was direct and generous. Miles was careful and brilliant. Owen was open in a way that suggested nobody had ever taught him to close. That was not luck. That was her. He watched the boys argue about the goal all the way to the parking lot and thought about that. Naomi was leaning against her car when he reached it. She'd arrived late to the game. He'd noticed her on the sideline 20 minutes into the second half, and she'd watched from the opposite end, and they had not stood together, which had been an unspoken mutual decision. "Owen claimed primary credit for the second goal," Adrian said. "Owen claims primary credit for most things." A small pause. Miles set it up. Miles set up everything, quietly, from the back. Naomi looked at her keys. "He's been asking me more questions since the coffee shop. About the history. He doesn't push the way Noah does. He just finds moments and asks one thing and then sits with the answer for a week and then asks one more thing." "What's he asking?" "Whether I'm okay." She said it simply, without embellishment. "He asks me whether I'm okay in specific contexts, after I have a long work call, after I've been reading documents late, after the stuff with Victor's filing this week." A pause. "He's watching to see whether all of this is costing me something." Adrian was quiet. "I don't know what to tell him," she said. "Because it is. It's not costing me more than I can carry, but the idea that he's been tracking my stress level since he was 6 years old because he felt like he needed to, that costs something. He shouldn't have to carry that." "No." She looked at the field, where the boys were now in a 3-way argument with 2 kids from the other team about some post-game disputed moment. "But he does. Because that's who he is, and who he is was partly shaped by circumstances I couldn't entirely protect him from." She looked at Adrian. "That's just the truth. It's not blame, it's just the record of what happened." "I know," he said. She nodded. She unlocked the car. "The files are going to Renata on Monday. She'll coordinate with Daniel." "Thank you." "Don't." Her voice wasn't sharp, just firm. "I mean it. I need you to stop thanking me for things that are just logistics of a situation we're both in." He held up a hand in acknowledgement. She called to the boys. They came. Noah still talking, Owen detaching from the argument with some final point he delivered to the Riverside kid before turning, Miles already moving toward the car before his name was fully out of her mouth. They loaded into the back seat with the particular chaos of 3 children in wet soccer gear, and as Naomi opened the driver's door, she paused. Miles has a design review at school next Thursday, his new structural project. She didn't look at him. 7 o'clock. Adrian said, "I'll be there." She got in the car. He watched it pull out of the lot and thought about a boy who checked on his mother after long phone calls and what it said about everything that had come before. The legal process accelerated through November. Victor's attorneys filed 3 separate motions in the first 2 weeks, all of them aimed at slowing or redirecting the federal inquiry, and Daniel defeated all 3 with a patience and methodical precision that Adrian found he was grateful to pay handsomely for. The fabricated design allegation against CNC was formally connected to the broader fraud case by mid-November, which began the process of dismantling it from the inside out. What Adrian had not been prepared for was the board. The 4 members who had initially expressed concern about process shifted their position as the documentation became too detailed to dismiss. Not all of them, not easily, but one by one the calculations changed. The 2 who had aligned with Victor found themselves with a choice between the sinking ship and the legal exposure of having known something, and both of them, in the end, chose the direction of cooperation. Victor had fewer allies than he'd believed. That was, in retrospect, the thing about building a network on fear and money rather than genuine loyalty. When the money dried up and the fear inverted, the network unraveled with startling speed. One evening in late November, Adrian sat in his office after the building had emptied and looked at the city through the window and thought about his father. His father had hired Victor. His father had trusted Victor with the company he'd spent 40 years building. Whether his father had known any part of what Victor was doing, that was a question Adrian had been turning over for weeks without a satisfying answer. He thought probably not. He thought probably his father had been, like Adrian, someone Victor had managed carefully and selectively informed. That was its own sadness. Not guilt exactly. Just the specific loss of discovering that someone you trusted was not what you believed them to be, compounded by the fact that you could no longer ask the person who had introduced you to them. He sat with that for a while. Then he turned off the office light and went home. His apartment felt, as it often did, too large and too quiet. He'd lived alone in it for 6 years, and he'd never really noticed that until recently. He poured a glass of water and stood in the kitchen and thought about a coffee shop on a Wednesday evening, and 3 boys in a wet parking lot arguing about soccer goals, and a woman who had built everything from nothing and raised 3 extraordinary people and asked him, across a conference room table, not to get this wrong again. He turned off the kitchen light. He did not sleep well, but he was getting used to that. The next Thursday came, Miles's design review. Adrian walked into the school gymnasium at 6:58 and found a seat 3 rows back, not in the front where it would be obvious and not in the back where it would look like he was hedging. And when Miles walked to the front of the room and set up his materials and scanned the audience and found Adrian's face, something in the boy's expression shifted, very slightly, very briefly, the controlled exterior giving way for just a moment to something younger and less defended. Then Miles turned back to his materials and began his presentation. He was thorough and precise and exactly as rigorous as the work itself warranted. When the teacher asked a question about the rotational testing apparatus, Miles explained the pivot design they had discussed, and then, without looking at Adrian, said, "I had help thinking through the geometry." Afterward, in the hallway, Miles came to stand beside him while Naomi spoke to the teacher. "You came," Miles said. "I said I would." Miles nodded, processing this. "You've said you would to a lot of things lately," he said, "and then you've done them." "I'm trying to," Adrian said. Miles looked at him with the steady, evaluating gaze that always made Adrian feel like he was being measured against a specification. "Owen thinks you're already family," he said. "Noah hasn't decided yet. I told them both that the data set is still too small." "That's a fair assessment. I'm not saying you're not trying," Miles said carefully. "I'm saying I need more data points." "Then I'll keep showing up," Adrian said, "until the data set is sufficient." Miles almost smiled. It was close. The corner of his mouth moved just slightly before his face reassembled itself. "Okay," he said. And then Naomi was done with the teacher and they walked out into the November evening together, The four of them, not quite fitting a pattern that had a name yet, but no longer fitting the pattern of strangers either, moving through the cold air toward the parking lot while Miles told his mother about the pivot mechanism in the vocabulary of a child who had recently discovered that some adults would actually follow along. December arrived cold and fast, the way it did in cities built close to water. And with it came the particular compression of a year moving toward its end while the things that mattered most remained unresolved. The federal case against Victor had passed through its initial phase and entered the period that Daniel described as procedurally stable but practically grinding, the kind of legal middle distance where the outcome was increasingly clear, but the path to it was long and required constant attention. Victor's attorneys were not conceding anything. They were doing what attorneys do when the facts are against them and the client can still afford the billing rate, which was to slow everything down and hope that something changed. Nothing changed. But it didn't move fast either. Adrian had restructured his days around two separate lives that were slowly, imperfectly, beginning to overlap. His mornings were still board calls and legal updates, and the ordinary machinery of running a company through a significant institutional crisis. His evenings, and most of his weekends, had become something else entirely. He drove 40 minutes south on Thursdays to attend whatever the boys had going on, a school performance, a project presentation. One Thursday, nothing was scheduled, and Naomi had texted him simply, "Miles wants to show you the new apparatus. 6 p.m. if you're free." And he'd rearranged two calls and driven down and spent 90 minutes in the garage of Naomi's house while Miles walked him through a testing rig the boy had built from hardware store components and pieces of his old construction toy sets, explaining load distribution with the focused precision of someone who had been thinking about nothing else for 2 weeks. Owen had come into the garage partway through and immediately tried to demonstrate a stress test that Miles had specifically said wasn't ready to demonstrate, and the resulting argument had been conducted entirely in the vocabulary of structural engineering, which was, Adrian thought, possibly the most specific sibling argument he'd ever witnessed. He had stood in Naomi's garage and watched two of his sons argue about tensile load tolerance and thought, "This is what I missed." Not the milestones, not the first words or the first steps, or whatever parents photographed and cataloged. This, the Tuesday evenings and the Thursday garage arguments, and the specific texture of ordinary life that doesn't announce itself as significant because it isn't, except that it is, completely. Naomi had been in the kitchen doorway for some of it. He'd seen her watching, not him specifically, but the whole scene, her expression doing the complicated thing it sometimes did when something was happening that she hadn't expected to feel anything about and was feeling something about anyway. She was careful with that. She would catch herself and pull the expression back to neutral, and Adrian was careful not to notice it too visibly, because noticing it felt like something she hadn't given him permission to do. He understood that. He was operating on a narrow permission set, and he had no standing to push the edges of it. Thus, the conversation he had been most dreading came on a Saturday afternoon in early December. He had taken the boys to a hardware store, Naomi's suggestion, for materials Miles needed, and the errand had expanded, the way errands do with children, into a 2-hour exercise in being asked questions about everything in every aisle. Owen had found a display of paint chips and spent 15 minutes constructing an elaborate color argument for why the living room at home should be the yellow one, not the boring yellow, the one that looks like a mango. Miles had compared the load ratings on 2 different grades of steel cable with an intensity that drew a respectful look from a store employee who was himself an engineer. Noah had found the fastener section and gone silent in the focused way he went silent around things that interested him. It was in the lumber section, while Adrian was helping Noah understand the difference between grades of plywood for a model he was planning, that Noah said, without particular transition, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come to the Meridian meeting?" Adrian looked at him. "Yes." "Like specifically?" "Yes." Noah ran his hand along the edge of a board. "I think about it," he said. "I started thinking about it after the coffee shop, like, there's a version of everything where you just sent someone else, and we never met you." Adrian let that sit for a moment before he answered. "That version was close," he said. "I almost didn't take this one personally." "Why did you?" Because the project was significant enough that I didn't want to negotiate it at a remove. He paused. I didn't know your mother was the other party until I walked into the room. Noah looked at the plywood. So it was an accident. Meeting her again was. Everything after that was a choice. Noah was quiet for a beat. Miles says that the fact that it was an accident at the start doesn't make the choices after it more or less real. He says a choice is a choice regardless of what caused the situation. Miles is right about that. He usually is. No resentment in it, just the plain acknowledgement of someone who has lived beside a mind like that for 8 years and made a practical peace with it. Adrian looked at his son, this direct, unsentimental, surprisingly tender kid who called from school offices and showed up to conversations with all his cards on the table and argued about soccer goals with a passion that was completely at odds with his general air of having considered the situation calmly. I need to ask you something, Noah said. He was still looking at the plywood. Okay. Do you want to be our dad, or do you want to fix what happened to our mom? Because those are different things, and I need to know which one it is. The question was the sharpest thing Noah had ever said to him. It was also, Adrian recognized immediately, exactly the right question. He took a breath. Both, he said, and I understand why that answer is complicated. Noah turned to look at him. The thing I broke with your mother, Adrian said carefully, is mine to address and hers to decide. That's separate from you three. Those are two different things I'm trying to do at the same time, and I'll admit they're connected in ways I can't always untangle cleanly. He paused. But I want to be your dad, not to fix anything, not because it makes me feel better about the past, because you are my son, and I have spent 8 years not knowing you, and I don't want to spend any more time not knowing you. Noah held his gaze. That's a good answer, he said finally. I don't know if it's the whole truth, but it's a good answer. It's the whole truth, Adrian said. I'm not in a position where I need to lie to you. No, Noah said. You're in a position where telling the truth is the only thing that has any chance of working. He said it without cruelty, just observation. So I can't entirely tell if you're being honest or strategic. Probably both, Adrian said. I don't think those are always different things. Noah thought about this. No, he said. I guess not. Miles appeared at the end of the aisle with the cable he'd selected and an expression that said he'd been waiting with controlled patience for several minutes. Are we getting the plywood or not? He said. Owen found the paint mixer and someone needs to supervise him. Noah looked at Adrian. Something had passed between them. Not resolved, not completed, but acknowledged in a way that would hold for now. Let's get the plywood, Noah said. The thing with the investor pressure on CNC resolved in the second week of December, which was faster than Renata had projected and slower than Naomi had wanted. The fabricated design allegation had been formally connected to the existing federal case, and once the origin of the documentation was established as part of Victor's broader pattern, the investors who had expressed concern began quietly reversing their positions. 2 of them sent formal letters restoring confidence. One asked for a call with Naomi directly, which she gave, and which lasted 40 minutes and ended with him apologizing for the interruption to the relationship. Naomi had accepted the apology without warmth and with complete professionalism, and after the call, she had sat in her office for a while looking at nothing. Renata had called afterward to confirm the resolution. It's handled, she said. The allegation is effectively dead. Good. Naomi. Renata paused in the way of someone who had been a professional ally for years and was stepping briefly out of that role. You should let yourself feel like you won something. I feel like I survived something, Naomi said. That's different. She meant it. Winning implied a contest on level ground. What had happened to CNC had not been a contest. It had been a predatory strike from a man who was facing consequences and had reached for the nearest weapon. The company had held, the investors had returned, but the holding had cost something. Days of emergency calls and sleepless nights, and the particular ache of watching something you built come under attack from a direction you hadn't been able to entirely prevent. She didn't tell the boys how close it had been. Owen wouldn't have understood the financial dimensions of it. Miles would have, completely, and she didn't want him to carry it. Noah would have found out eventually on his own, but she bought herself some time by keeping the coverage narrow and professional. What she did do, on the Saturday after the resolution, was take all three of them out to the waterfront. A cold December afternoon, the kind where you wore extra layers and your breath showed and the city across the water looked sharp and clean. And they walked the promenade of the site that would become the Meridian Project, and she pointed out what was there now and what it would become, and she talked to them about what the project meant and how it had gotten to where it was. Miles asked about the financial structure. Owen asked about what color the buildings would be. Noah asked why she'd named the firm CNC. Carter and, he stopped himself. Carter and what? What's the second C? She looked at the water. Carter and children, she said. I named it that when I found out about you. Before you were born. A pause. I wanted whatever I built to be yours eventually, if you wanted it. None of them said anything for a moment. Owen slipped his hand into hers, which was just what Owen did. Miles looked at the site with an expression she couldn't fully read. Noah looked at her in the way he looked at things he was going to be thinking about for a long time. You always knew we'd be here, Noah said. I knew I was going to build something worth being here, she said. The rest, I just hoped. Adrian came to the waterfront site for the first time on a Tuesday, a site visit Naomi had arranged as part of the ongoing Meridian negotiations. The deal had continued moving forward through all of it, through the legal filings and the investor pressure and the November Saturdays and the Thursday garage sessions, and was now close enough to a final framework that both parties had agreed to a joint site walk. They walked the 12 acres with their respective project leads, and Adrian moved through the space the way someone moves when they're genuinely trying to understand it rather than just check a box. He asked about drainage, about the underground utility infrastructure, about the sightlines from the residential portion to the water. His questions were technical and specific, and Naomi answered them in the same register, and for stretches of the morning they were just two people doing professional work together, and it was almost ordinary. Almost. There was a moment near the north end of the site where the old shipping infrastructure was still standing, rusted gantries, a partially dismantled loading structure, where they ended up slightly ahead of the rest of the group, and Naomi stopped and looked at the industrial skeleton against the gray December sky. This section has the most complicated remediation, she said, soil contamination from the old marine activity. The timeline adds 4 months minimum. I know, I read the environmental assessment. Most developers try to move past it fast in the presentation. I'm not most developers. He paused. Also, I've learned something about what cutting corners on the difficult parts of a project actually costs. She looked at him. He was looking at the gantry structure, not at her. That's broader than soil remediation, she said. Yes, he said. It is. She turned back to the water. The rest of the group was about 60 yards back, giving them what was either professional courtesy or an intentional moment, she wasn't sure which. Miles told me about the plywood conversation, she said. I figured he would. He said Noah asked you the right question. He did. What was your answer? He turned to look at her now. I told him both things were true and that they were separate things I was trying to do at the same time. He paused, and that I couldn't always untangle them cleanly. She nodded slowly. What would your answer have been? He said. If you'd been him. She thought about it honestly. I think I would have told you that the problem with both being true is that one of them can excuse the other in ways that aren't fair. She looked at the water. Doing right by the boys doesn't fix what happened between us. And doing right by me doesn't automatically make you their father. I understand that. Do you? I understand it the way you understand something you can't change, he said. I can't untangle the history. I can't make the separation between the two things as clean as it should be. What I can do is keep showing up to both of them and let you and them decide separately what they add up to. She was quiet for a moment. The water was moving in the slow winter way, gray and restless. Behind them she could hear the project lead saying something about the north parcel setback. I'm not where I was, she said finally. With you. She said it carefully, measuring each word. I'm not still in that courthouse, but I'm also not. I don't know where I am with you. I'm somewhere in the middle of a thing I don't have a name for yet. That's honest, he said. I'm trying to be. So am I. The project lead called their names from 60 yards back, something about the boundary survey markers. They both turned and walked back toward the group, and the professional distance closed between them, and they were two principals on a sidewalk again, and the moment folded itself into the ordinary texture of the morning. 3 days before Christmas, Victor's attorneys filed an emergency motion that everyone on Daniel's team had been expecting and no one had been looking forward to. The motion alleged that the primary federal filing had been made in bad faith as a mechanism to seize company control during a period of disputed succession, and requested an immediate stay pending an independent review. It was, in Daniel's assessment, a delay tactic of the highest order, expensive, technically complex, almost certainly unsuccessful, but capable of adding 3 to 4 months to the timeline if it gained any traction at all. Daniel called Adrian at 7 in the evening. "We'll defeat it," he said, "but not before January. The holiday calendar kills any emergency hearing before the new year." So we're paused. The federal component is paused. The CNC allegation dismissal proceeds on its own track and isn't affected. Adrian sat in his kitchen. Outside his window, the city had Christmas lights on the high-rise facades across the street, which he'd always found a slightly surreal thing, all that glass and steel wrapped in seasonal decoration, as if scale didn't change what the gesture meant. "What does Victor have access to right now?" Adrian asked. "Realistically, his personal assets are frozen but not seized. He still has access to some international accounts we haven't been able to touch through the current filing. His network is significantly reduced but not eliminated." A pause. "He's not without resources. Is he dangerous?" Daniel was quiet for a moment in a way that was different from his regular thinking pauses. "I think he's in the position of a man who can see the outcome and is calculating whether there's anything left to lose." Another pause. "I don't have anything specific, but I'd recommend being careful about the CNC public events coming up. The waterfront opening is in January? The ribbon cutting is the 14th, Adrian said. It's a public event. Naomi's whole team will be there, investors, city officials. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying be aware." After the call, Adrian sat for a while. Then he called Naomi. She answered on the third ring, slightly breathless, some background noise that sounded like the boys. "Hold on," she said, and then, away from the phone, "Miles, that goes in the recycling, not the trash. Yes, the box too." Then back to him. "Sorry, what is it?" Victor filed an emergency motion. Daniel will defeat it, but the timeline extends into January. "Okay." Her voice shifted to the professional register. "Does that affect the Meridian closing?" "Not directly, but Daniel mentioned the waterfront opening. He recommended we review the security arrangements." A pause. "You think Victor would do something at the opening?" "I think Daniel has a point about a man who can see the outcome and is calculating what he has left to lose." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her moving to a different room, the background noise of the boys reducing. "The opening has city officials, 200 guests, and a fairly significant media presence," she said. "Victor is not stupid enough to do something at an event like that." "No," Adrian said. "Probably not. But I'd feel better if the boys weren't there." Another pause, longer. When she spoke again, her voice was measured, but something underneath it had shifted. "You're asking me to keep my kids away from the opening of the project they've watched me build for 2 years. I'm asking you to think about it. They've been to every site walk. Owen has a photo on my office wall from the groundbreaking. Miles knows the structural specs of that building better than half my team." Her voice was controlled, and something in it was not controlled at all. "This is their project." "I know that." "Do you?" Not a question. "Naomi." His voice was steady. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you that a man who has spent 6 months doing whatever it takes to protect himself is running out of options, and the thing he has historically been willing to use is the people closest to me." A pause. "Which now includes 3 people who are yours." The silence stretched. "He wouldn't," she said. "He turned your company into a weapon. He used your marriage as cover for fraud. He forged evidence to destroy a pregnant woman's life. He said each thing plainly. I'm not predicting what he'll do. I'm saying the profile exists." She didn't respond immediately. He could hear her breathing. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's all I'm asking." She ended the call. He stood in his kitchen with the phone in his hand and the Christmas lights blinking in the dark across the street and thought about Daniel's phrase, "A man who can see the outcome and is calculating what he has left to lose." Christmas itself was the first one they spent in the same general vicinity, though not together. Adrian had been invited, through the medium of Owen sending him a hand-drawn card that said, "You should come to Christmas," in letters of varying size, to stop by on Christmas morning. The invitation had been conveyed to Naomi by Owen, who had apparently decided that his role in this situation was to accelerate whatever was happening by removing the intermediate steps. And Naomi had relayed it to Adrian with a text that said simply, "Owen invited you for Christmas morning. 10 a.m. if you want to come. It will be chaotic." He had wanted to come. He brought nothing extravagant. He'd thought carefully about this, so too much would be exactly wrong. A man trying to buy his way into a morning that hadn't been earned, and the boys were at an age where extravagance read as unfamiliarity with who they actually were. Miles had mentioned the rotational apparatus needing a specific type of calibration tool. Owen had once said, during a soccer game conversation, that he wanted to learn to draw buildings like his mother. Noah had, without meaning to, mentioned that he'd worn out his field notebook from going to project sites with Naomi and needed a new one. He showed up at 10 in the morning with a calibration kit in a small case, a set of architectural drawing tools in a quality that was serious without being intimidating, and a leather-bound field notebook with Noah's name embossed on the cover. Owen opened the door. He looked at Adrian and then at the bags and then back at Adrian with an expression of uncomplicated joy. "You actually came," he said. "You invited me." "I know, but I didn't know if you'd actually come." He stepped back to let him in. "Mom said you might not because it was a lot." "It is a lot," Adrian agreed, "but you came anyway." "Yes." Owen seemed to find this deeply satisfying. He shouted into the house that Adrian was there, which produced a crash from what sounded like the kitchen, Miles's voice saying something sharp, and Noah appearing at the top of the stairs with bedhead and the expression of someone who had been awake for several hours on a Christmas morning and had already used up significant emotional energy. "You came," Noah said. "Owen seems surprised by this too." Owen expected it. Owen is never surprised by things he expects. Noah came down the stairs. "Miles is surprised. He's hiding it. I noticed. He's in the kitchen. He made hot chocolate, which he does when he's trying to act like everything is normal." Adrian looked toward the kitchen. "Mom's in the living room," Noah said, quieter. "She's okay. She cleaned up 3 times this morning, which means she's nervous." Adrian looked at Noah. "I'm just telling you," Noah said. "So, you know." He walked into the living room. Naomi was by the window with a mug, and she had, as Noah indicated, clearly arranged the room with a level of attention that was more than the occasion required, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that was composed and slightly self-conscious, in a way she would have disliked knowing he could see. "Merry Christmas," he said. "Merry Christmas," she said. "Owen shouldn't have—" "I wanted to come," he said. "I would have asked if he hadn't." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the bags. "What did you bring?" He told her. She listened, and when he got to the field notebook, she looked away briefly at the window, and he didn't ask about her expression. Miles came in from the kitchen with 4 mugs on a tray, which he distributed with the efficiency of someone who had made the decision to be helpful and was executing it without sentimentality. He handed Adrian a mug and then stood there for a moment. "The calibration kit," he said. "Is it the one you showed me in the catalog?" "Yes." Miles looked at the bag. He didn't reach for it immediately, which was its own kind of response. "Thank you," he said quietly. They sat together for 2 hours. The boys opened things and argued about things, and Owen drew his first architectural sketch using the new tools and showed it to his mother with an expression of pure pride, and she looked at it with great seriousness and told him the proportions were already better than her first attempt, which may or may not have been true, but was exactly the right thing to say. Adrian sat on the couch and watched it happen. All of it. The ordinary chaos of a family morning, the specific texture of these 3 children in their home with their mother, The way Naomi moved through all of it, like a person who had built this life one deliberate brick at a time and knew the weight of every wall. At one point, she sat next to him on the couch. Not because she'd decided to, but because Owen had pushed in between them from one side, and Miles was on the floor, and the spatial logic of the room had arranged them that way. And she was close enough that he was aware of her in the particular way you're aware of someone you have history with. And she was looking at Owen's drawing with her mug in both hands, and not looking at Adrian, and he was not looking at her either. "He draws better than Noah did at his age," she said quietly. "Noah drew everything on fire. Buildings, trees, cars, all on fire." "That seems on brand." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Noah, from across the room, said, "I can hear you," without looking up from his new notebook. "I know," Naomi said. It was an ordinary moment. Adrian was aware of it specifically because of that. The fact that it was ordinary, that it had the texture of something unremarkable, something that would not be remembered on its own but was part of the accumulated fabric of days that eventually, improbably, became a life. He had missed 8 years of this fabric. He understood that he would never have those back, that the debt was not one that could be paid, that the most honest accounting of it was simply to accept the loss and not let it become an excuse to stop trying. He drank his hot chocolate. Miles, from the floor, began explaining to Owen how the perspective lines in architectural drawing worked, and Owen listened with the unusual attention of someone who had asked for the information and genuinely wanted it, and Noah wrote something in his new notebook that he tilted away from the room in the practiced manner of a person who had been keeping his thoughts private for as long as he could remember. Outside, the winter city was quiet in the way it got on Christmas morning, the traffic thin and the light gray and flat, and inside the house there was warmth and noise and the particular alive quality of a family being itself without performance. Adrian stayed until noon. When he left, Owen hugged him in the decisive way Owen did everything. Miles shook his hand, which was somehow exactly right. Noah walked him to the door and stood in the doorway and said, "Same time next year?" with a lightness that was covering something more serious. "Same time next year," Adrian said. Naomi was visible from the doorway, gathering something from the coffee table, not watching. He walked to his car in the cold December air and sat in it for a moment before starting it, looking at the house with its lights on and the city quiet around it. And he thought about the waterfront opening on January 14th, and Daniel's careful pause on the phone, and the profile of a man calculating what he had left to lose. He thought about those 3 boys in that house. He started the car and drove back. January arrived, and with it, the final week before the Meridian waterfront opening. The project itself was finished ahead of the adjusted schedule, which was a thing Naomi had pushed for through December with a focus that her team privately described as extraordinary and publicly described as efficient. The building had been completed, the public promenade installed, the landscaping along the water's edge planted and settled. It looked, in photographs and in person, like exactly what Naomi had told the conference room it would look like 7 months ago. Public waterfront that functioned as public waterfront, a development that served the community it was built in rather than simply occupying it. Adrian had walked the finished project with her on a Tuesday morning 5 days before the opening. They'd gone early, before the site was staffed, and she'd had a key to the promenade gate, and they'd walked it in the January cold with their breath showing and no particular agenda. She had stopped at several points to look at things, not appraising, not checking, just looking in the way of a person seeing the finished form of something that had existed in their head for a long time. At the north end, where the old industrial skeleton had been cleared and the soil remediation had been completed, and the promenade now curved open to the widest view of the water, she stood for a long time without saying anything. Adrian stood beside her. "It's good," he said finally. "Yes," she said. Simple. No performance of modesty. "You should be proud of it." She looked at him sideways. "I am." "I mean that without qualification." He paused. "This was yours to build. The negotiation, the Meridian project. That's business. This was yours." She looked back at the water. "There's a version of this project where we never met and I built it without you and it looks exactly like this." "I know." "I want you to know that I know that," she said. "I'm not confused about what I built and what was contingent on anything else. You shouldn't be confused about it, he said. Nobody should be. She turned to look at him fully, which was something she didn't always do. Usually there was the partial attention, the face that allowed engagement while holding something in reserve. This time, she just looked at him. I don't know what to do with you, she said. It wasn't cruel. It was just true. I know. 8 months ago, you were a name on a project brief. Now you're at my house on Christmas morning, and my sons talk about you and I. She stopped. You don't have to finish that. I'm aware. She looked back at the water. But I want to because I've been saying incomplete sentences around you for months, and I'm tired of the incompleteness. A pause. I think about who you were, and I think about who you're being now, and I can't always tell if they're different people or the same person in different circumstances. And I need to know the difference because one of those means something and the other one is just pressure-producing behavior. He was quiet for a moment. The honest answer, he said, is that I'm the same person. I'm not a different man. I'm the same man who was 30 years old and scared and made choices he shouldn't have. The difference is that the circumstances stripped away every reason I had for not seeing clearly. He paused. I don't know if that's the answer you want. It's the honest one, she said, which is what I asked for. They stood at the water's edge a while longer. The city was waking up around them, the early morning sounds of traffic beginning to build on the streets above the promenade. In 6 days, this space would be full of people, guests and officials and journalists and the public, because that was what the public promenade was for. And the project would exist in the world in the way finished things do, complete and independent of the people who built it. The boys are coming to the opening, Naomi said. I thought about what you said. I looked at the security plan. I added 2 additional personnel at the perimeter. She paused. They're not missing this. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They walked back through the promenade toward the gate, their footsteps quiet on the new pavement, the water moving beside them in the cold January light. The 14th of January came in clear and cold, the kind of winter morning that made a waterfront look its best. Sharp light off the water, sky the particular blue that only happened when the temperature dropped below freezing and the air had no humidity left in it, the new promenade pavement clean and pale in the early sun. Naomi arrived at the site at 7:30, 2.5 hours before the public opening, and walked every section of it one more time, not checking. She'd checked everything the day before. This was something else. The thing you do when you've spent years on something and it's finally done and you need to stand inside it one more time before it belongs to everyone. Her project lead, a steady woman named Carmen, who had been with CNC for 4 years, fell in beside her at the north end without being asked, and they walked in companionable silence for a while. Security confirmed the additional perimeter personnel, Naomi said. 6:30 this morning, 2 at the north gate, 1 at each maintenance access point, 2 circulating. Carmen paused. Adrian's firm also sent 2 private security contractors. They checked in an hour ago. Naomi stopped walking. He didn't tell me he was doing that. They have credentials. I cleared them. Carmen looked at her carefully. Do you want me to send them back? Naomi stood there for a moment. The water moved. The new promenade curved away from her in both directions. Everything she'd designed and fought for and built, solid and finished and real. No, she said. Leave them. She pulled out her phone and sent Adrian a text. You sent security without telling me. His reply came in under a minute. I should have told you. I'm sorry. Do you want me to pull them? She typed back, no. But next time you ask first. His reply? Understood. She put the phone away and kept walking. The boys arrived with Adrian at 9:45, which was the arrangement. Naomi had been at the site all morning, and Adrian had picked them up from the house and driven them down. This was the first time he'd done a school-run type errand without Naomi present, and all 3 boys had apparently treated the car ride with varying degrees of their characteristic selves. Owen had talked continuously about the opening. Miles had asked 2 specific questions about the structural specifications of the promenade seating, and then sat quietly. And Noah had looked out the window and said, about halfway there, Are you nervous? A little, Adrian had said. About what? Today, the event, making sure everything goes right. Noah had looked at him. It's Mom's event. You don't have to make sure it goes right. She already did that. It was, Adrian thought, the most clarifying thing anyone had said to him in months. He parked and walked them through the public entrance, and they came through the gate onto the promenade, and Owen made a sound that was not quite a word and stopped walking and just looked. It was the kind of response that required no interpretation. The waterfront opened up ahead of them, the wide, pale pavement, the water beyond it, the new buildings rising clean against the January sky, the public space genuinely feeling like public space in the way Naomi had argued for in the conference room 8 months ago, and delivered in January with exactly the proportions and sight lines she'd described. Miles said, "The north section." He was looking at the curve of the promenade. She moved the commercial frontage back. She moved it back 6 meters, Adrian said. The water view is unobstructed for the full length. Miles nodded. He looked at it for another moment. She was right, he said, which from Miles was the highest available rating. Naomi found them near the center pavilion about 20 minutes before the formal opening. She looked at her sons in the way she always looked at them at significant moments, a quick, complete scan that was taking inventory of whether they were okay, which they were, and then she looked at Adrian. "Thank you for bringing them," she said. "Thank you for letting me." Owen grabbed her hand. "Mom, the north section." "I know," she said. "I know." Demand. The formal opening ceremony began at 10 and ran for approximately 35 minutes. There were remarks from a city councilwoman, brief words from 2 of the project's community partners, and then Naomi at the podium, calm and direct, and specific about what the project was and what it was intended to do, giving credit precisely and personally to the people who had built it. She did not speak about herself, which was consistent with how she operated. And when the councilwoman returned to the podium to note that CNC development had transformed an abandoned industrial site into genuinely public waterfront space, Naomi accepted the acknowledgement without performance. Adrian stood with the boys on the right side of the gathered crowd. Owen was between him and Noah. Miles was slightly to the left, watching his mother at the podium with an expression that was, for Miles, openly proud. Adrian watched too. He watched her at the podium in the January sun with the promenade and the water behind her, and he thought about a conference room 8 months ago and a woman who had walked in and looked up and managed, with enormous effort, he now understood, to be exactly as composed as she'd appeared. He thought about what it had cost to be that composed. He thought about 3 children raised inside that composure, learning from it without knowing the full weight of what had produced it. The remarks concluded. The ribbon was cut. Owen had petitioned vigorously to be part of the ribbon cutting, and Naomi had arranged for all 3 boys to hold the ribbon, and the photograph that resulted had Miles at one end looking serious, Noah in the middle grinning in spite of himself, and Owen at the other end with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. That photograph would later hang in Naomi's office, and in Adrian's apartment, and eventually in a hallway of the building that stood where the abandoned gantries used to be. But that was later. Right now the ribbon fell, and the crowd moved forward onto the promenade, and the event became the kind of moving, social, slightly chaotic thing that public openings became, and the boys dispersed into it. Owen immediately attaching himself to one of the catering staff who had a tray of something he was interested in, Miles making his way systematically along the promenade railing, Noah drifting toward the water's edge with his field notebook. Adrian was watching Miles when he saw Victor. He almost didn't recognize him at first. Victor had not been at any public event since the federal filing, had not appeared in any press coverage, had been represented entirely through attorneys and statements. He was wearing a dark coat and had positioned himself near the maintenance access point on the south end of the promenade, and he was not looking at the ceremony or the crowd. He was looking at the boys. Adrian was moving before he'd finished the thought. He crossed the promenade in the direction of Victor, pulling out his phone to call Daniel, and then he stopped because Victor had moved too, and he was not moving toward Adrian. He was moving toward the pavilion where the catering tables were, where Owen had last been standing, and the crowd had shifted and thickened, and Adrian couldn't see Owen anymore. He called Carmen first because she was on site. "Victor Hale is on the promenade, South Pavilion area. I need your security personnel now." Then he called Naomi. She picked up in one ring. "Where are you?" "Victor is here. I'm moving toward the South Pavilion. I can't see Owen." He heard the change in her breathing. "I'm coming." Nothing else. She ended the call. The crowd was 200 people in an open waterfront space, which was both a lot and not enough. Not enough because the sightlines were interrupted constantly, too many bodies, and Adrian was moving fast but not running because running would scatter people and he needed to see. He found Owen near the pavilion's east column, standing with a plate of something, talking to a man Adrian didn't recognize. The security contractor Carmen had placed at the south gate was already moving toward them from the far side. Victor was 7 meters away, coming from the maintenance access, and there was something in the way he was moving. Too direct, too focused, that confirmed everything Daniel had said about a man calculating what he had left to lose. Adrian reached Owen first. He put himself between Owen and Victor and turned to face him, and for a moment the three of them were in a small pocket of stillness inside the larger noise of the event. Victor looked at him. Up close, he looked different than the last time Adrian had seen him in the office. Thinner, and something in his expression had the quality of a man who had spent 2 months with attorneys and asset freezes and watched his network reduce to nothing. The confidence that had always occupied space around him was still there, but it was doing something different now, working harder, the performance of it more visible. "Adrian," he said, his voice was level, "I wanted to see the project." "This is a public event," Adrian said. "You're welcome to see the project from the public entrance." He did not move. Behind him, he could feel Owen's stillness. The boy had registered that something had changed in the air and had, characteristically, stopped talking. "Is this your son?" Victor said. He was looking at Owen, not at Adrian. "Don't," Adrian said, quietly. "I'm just asking." The same words Noah had used at their first meeting, but nothing like the way Noah had used them. The security contractor arrived at Victor's left shoulder. Carmen appeared from the right. And then Naomi was there. She had come through the crowd faster than Adrian would have thought possible, and she put her hand on Owen's shoulder and moved him gently back, and she looked at Victor Hale with an expression that Adrian had never seen on her face in 8 months of knowing her again. It was not fear. It was not anger, exactly. It was the expression of a woman who had spent 8 years on the other side of what this man had done and was now standing in something she had built with her own hands, and he was in it, and she was done. "You need to leave," she said. Victor looked at her. Something moved through his expression. Not remorse, nothing that clean, but something that was the faint shadow of recognition. The look of a man who is finally seeing, at too late a stage, the full shape of what he set in motion. "Naomi," he started. "Don't," she said. Same word Adrian had used, different weight behind it. "I have nothing to say to you, and you have nothing to offer me. Leave this property, or I will have you removed." The security contractor stepped forward. Victor looked at him, then at Carmen, then at the small space of attention that had begun to form as nearby guests registered the quality of the conversation without hearing its content. He left. Carmen and the contractor walked him to the perimeter. Adrian watched him go, and then he turned back. Owen was looking at him with the wide, open expression of a child who has understood that something serious just happened and is waiting to understand what. "Are you okay?" Adrian asked him. "Who was that man?" Owen said. Naomi looked at Adrian over Owen's head. A long look. Not thanking him, not assessing him. Something more complete than either. "Someone from before," she told Owen. "He's gone now." Owen looked at the direction Victor had gone. Then he looked at Adrian, then at his mother. "Was he dangerous?" he said. "He was," Naomi said. "He's not anymore." Owen seemed to weigh this. Then he held out his plate. "Do you want some of this? I don't know what it is, but it's really good." Naomi made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. Short and unguarded, the kind that slips out before a person has time to manage it. She pressed her hand briefly over her mouth. Then she dropped her hand and her face was ordinary again. But the laugh had been real and Adrian had seen it, and it was, in the accounting of small things that mattered, significant. "No, thank you," she said to Owen. "I'll have some," Adrian said. Owen looked pleased. Must sit. Noah found out what had happened within about 20 minutes, because Noah always found out, and he came to stand beside his father at the promenade railing with his notebook and said, "Miles says Victor Hale was here." He was. Is he going to do something else? The security team is coordinating with Daniel's office right now, Adrian said. His presence at a public event in violation of certain conditions of his current legal situation is going to cost him. He paused. He won't be doing anything else. Noah looked at the water. Were you scared? Yes, Adrian said. When I couldn't see Owen. Noah nodded, absorbing this. Miles was tracking where Owen was the whole time, he said. He saw you moving and he started watching Owen's position. He told me afterward. Adrian turned to look at him. He didn't say anything to anyone, Noah said. He just watched, in case. He paused. That's what Miles does. He pays attention to everything quietly, so that if something goes wrong, there's information. Adrian thought about that. Miles, 8 years old, quietly tracking his brother's location at a public event because something in the air had changed and he had registered it, and he had done what he knew how to do. Not because anyone asked, not because he announced it, just because someone needed to be watching. He gets that from your mother, Adrian said. Noah looked at him. Yeah, he said. He does. They stood at the railing together for a while. The event was winding down around them. The crowd thinning, the catering tables being cleared, the city officials taking their leave with their photographs and their handshakes. The promenade remained, solid and present, the water moving beside it in the January cold. After today, Noah said, what happens? The federal case continues. Victor's appearance here will accelerate certain proceedings. Adrian paused. Eventually, there will be a resolution, and it will be public, and you'll be able to read everything if you want to. That's not what I meant. Adrian looked at him. I meant with us, Noah said. What happens with us? He was 9 years old. He had been asking the right questions since the beginning, asking them directly and waiting for direct answers, and he deserved one now. I keep showing up, Adrian said. That's what happens. Nothing dramatic, I just keep showing up. To the Saturday games and the science presentations and the hardware stores, and eventually that accumulates into something that has a name. And Mom? A pause. That's a different conversation, and slower, and not mine to decide. Noah looked at the water. She laughed today, he said, when Owen offered her the food. I know, I was there. She doesn't do that often. A pause. The real kind, where she doesn't mean to. He looked sideways at Adrian. I'm not saying that's because of you. I know you're not. I'm just noting that it happened. Adrian looked at his son. Noted, he said. The federal proceedings against Victor Hale concluded in the spring. It took 4 months from the January opening to the day Victor entered a guilty plea to 12 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and criminal conspiracy. The plea was, in Daniel's estimation, the outcome of a man who had run out of legal maneuvers and could not afford the outcome of a trial. It was also practically faster than a full trial would have been. And Daniel had negotiated certain conditions of the plea that allowed the civil components, restitution to Blackwell Holdings, formal record correction in the divorce proceedings, acknowledgement of the defamation campaign against Naomi, to be resolved concurrently. Adrian was not in the courtroom when Victor entered the plea. He'd decided not to be. Daniel had asked once, and Adrian had said he didn't need to be in the room for the outcome, and Daniel had understood. What he did do, on the day the plea was entered and confirmed and the first press coverage ran, was drive to Naomi's office. He knocked. She was at her drafting table alone, and she looked up when he came in, and he could see that she already knew. She'd clearly been reading something on her phone when he entered, and her expression had the quality of someone who has been sitting with significant news for a few minutes. Daniel called me, she said. I know, I asked him to call you first. She looked at him. Sit down. He sat in the chair across from her desk. On the wall behind her was the photograph from the ribbon cutting. Miles, Noah, Owen, the ribbon, the January light. 12 counts, she said. Yes. The civil component includes formal correction of the divorce record. Yes. The documentation of the forged evidence becomes part of the official record. It will be publicly accessible. She was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, the coastal city did its late morning things, traffic, the distant sound of water, ordinary life. I spent a long time, she said carefully, Being angry at you. Not at Victor. At you. She looked at the desk. Because he was an abstraction for most of it. I didn't know his name for years. I just knew what happened. And what happened had your face on it. She paused. That's not fair, but it's true. It's fair, Adrian said. I was the one who signed the papers. You were deceived. I was also a man who chose the version of events that was easier to live with, he said. That's not entirely the same as being deceived. She looked at him. Something in the air between them had the quality of a door that had been closed for a long time and was now, in some fundamental way, open. Not swung wide, not dramatic, just no longer shut. I don't forgive him, she said. Victor, I want you to know that. Whatever the legal record says, whatever the formal acknowledgement is, I don't forgive him, and I'm not going to perform a forgiveness I don't feel. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm telling you because I've been honest about everything else, and I want to be honest about that too. She paused. But the anger at you, the specific particular anger at you, I've been carrying that for 8 years and it's very heavy, and I'm tired of carrying it. She said it plainly, without self-pity. I don't know if what I feel is forgiveness exactly. It might just be exhaustion with the weight of the alternative. Adrian sat with that for a moment. He didn't try to shape it into something more than she'd offered. I'll take it, he said. Her mouth moved. Almost. The boys want to do something, she said, shifting. For your birthday in March. Owen's been planning it for 2 months. I thought you should know, so you're not surprised. What's he planning? I genuinely don't know. He's been secretive about it, which is unprecedented behavior for Owen, so I assume it's elaborate. I'll act surprised. You won't have to. Knowing Owen, you will be surprised. She looked back at her drafting table. Miles wants to show you the full rotational apparatus. He finished it last week. He hasn't shown me yet. Adrian understood what that meant. I'm honored, he said. You should be. He showed me a prototype of something once before he showed anyone else in his life. One time. She paused. You're the second person. He didn't say anything. Some things didn't need a response. He stood to leave and she stood too, which she didn't always do, and for a moment they were both standing on the same side of a desk that had always felt like the border of something, and it was a short distance between them, and she looked at him with an expression that was not closed. March, she said. Owen's event. Don't work that Saturday. I won't, he said. He left. He drove back to the city along the coastal road, the water visible in breaks between the buildings, and he thought about what she'd said. The anger at you. I've been carrying it for 8 years, and it's very heavy. And he thought about the specific thing it meant that she'd told him that. Not forgiving the weight, not pretending the weight wasn't real, just saying she was putting it down. There was more honesty in that than in most things people called forgiveness. The months that followed were not a transformation. That was the thing Adrian would try to articulate later when he tried to explain it to himself. There was no single moment, no single event, no clean before and after. There was just accumulation. Ordinary time building up like sediment, laying down layer after layer of the unremarkable until the unremarkable became, without announcing itself, the substance of a life. He coached Little League in the spring. He was a mediocre coach who knew less about baseball than he'd admitted when Owen had asked him to do it, and he spent a significant portion of March reading coaching manuals on his phone, which Miles had observed and pointed out and not mocked him for, which felt like a specific kind of acceptance. He was bad at the strategic signaling. He was good at the boys who got frustrated and needed someone to say, without drama, that it was still okay. Owen's birthday event turned out to be a scavenger hunt he had designed himself, with handwritten clues on index cards, and a final destination at an ice cream place near the waterfront where he had prearranged, somehow, through methods Adrian chose not to fully investigate, for the staff to write happy birthday on the window in soap marker, except Owen had asked them to write it in the wrong direction, which he thought was funnier than the alternative. It was. Adrian had laughed. The real kind. The kind that came out before he managed it. Noah showed him the field notebook in May. He'd been filling it since Christmas, and it was 2/3 full. Project observations from site visits with his mother, sketches of buildings he liked, notes from conversations that he apparently found worth recording. He didn't explain why he was showing it. He just handed it to Adrian and let him look, and Adrian turned pages carefully and didn't say anything for a while because there wasn't anything to say that was adequate to the weight of being trusted with it. On one page, in the careful handwriting of a 9-year-old who was trying to write neatly, Noah had written, "Things I know for sure. Mom built everything herself. Miles always has a plan. Owen always believes things will be okay. I don't know where I got what I have, but I think it's mine." Adrian read that twice. Then he handed the notebook back. "That last line," he said. "Yeah? You got it from yourself." He paused. "Nobody gave you that. You built that the same way your mother built the company, from the inside out." Noah looked at him. Then he looked at the notebook. Then he closed it. "Okay," he said, not dismissive, the same word he'd used months ago in the coffee shop, carrying the same weight. "I'm taking this in, and it's going to take some time." Adrian understood now what that word meant when Noah used it. Mom. Blackwell Holdings ceased to exist in its original form in the summer. The restructuring had been Adrian's decision, made formally in the months after Victor's plea, and executed carefully through the spring. The remaining assets were separated, some sold, some transferred, some reorganized, and the significant remainder became the foundation of a new entity that was, in purpose and structure, the opposite of what Blackwell Holdings had been. Not a private accumulator of real estate value, but a public deployer of it, funding affordable housing development, vocational training programs in construction trades, and community land trusts in underserved neighborhoods. Naomi agreed to chair the foundation's Development Advisory Board, which was both professionally appropriate. She was among the most qualified people in the country for the role, and something else, something that existed in the category of choices that changed the shape of a life without anyone declaring that they were doing so. She had said yes without drama. They'd been standing in the parking lot after a school event, the boys already in the car, the evening cooling around them, and he'd asked and she'd looked at him for a moment with the particular expression she wore when she was deciding something that mattered, and she'd said yes and gotten in the car. That was all. It was enough. The first board meeting was in August. They sat across a conference table again, as they had a year before, except the configuration was different now. No opposing attorneys, no negotiating posture, no careful management of distance. Naomi sat at the head of the table because that was her role and she was efficient about her roles, and Adrian sat to her left because that was where the chair was. And they worked through a 2-hour agenda with the focused productivity of people who understood each other's professional language. Afterward, in the hallway, she said, "That went well?" "It did." "You argued against the vocational program timeline." "Because the timeline was too aggressive for the first cohort. It would have set them up to underdeliver." "I know, you were right." She gathered her materials. "You're good at the difficult counterpoint. You don't soften it." "I learned from watching you do it." She looked at him. "That's not entirely a compliment." "It's meant as one." She considered him for a moment, the measuring look, the one that had existed since the conference room a year ago, that he had learned to sit still inside of without trying to manage it. Then she said, "The boys want to come to the waterfront on Saturday. All 3 of them, including Miles, which is unusual." "I'll be there." "You don't need to be. They just want to walk the promenade." "I know I don't need to be," he said. "I want to be." She looked at him. Then she nodded, once, and walked toward the elevator. Saturday came warm and light, the way August moved in a coastal city, the water flat and almost silver in the late afternoon, the promenade full of the people it had been designed for, families and older couples, and the occasional runner and a group of teenagers who had claimed the north section benches with the unconscious authority of teenagers everywhere. The 5 of them walked the full length. It was not the first time they'd all been in the same place at once. They had been accumulating those moments since Christmas, since the soccer games, since the opening. But this felt different in a way that was hard to name precisely. Easier, maybe. Less managed. The space between the 5 of them had been filled in gradually, the way a room fills when people live in it long enough. Not through grand gesture, but through the presence of small things. the accumulated evidence of ordinary time. Owen talked constantly. This was baseline Owen, and everyone had made peace with it as a feature rather than a flaw. He had opinions about which section of the promenade was best, and which of his mother's design decisions had been correct, and which had been pretty good, but he would have done it differently, a statement he delivered with an airiness that made Miles say, without looking up, "You have never designed anything except a birthday scavenger hunt," which was excellent, Owen said. Objectively, Noah agreed. "Thank you, Noah." "I'm not complimenting you, I'm conceding a fact." "A compliment is a fact with feelings," Owen said. Miles looked at him. "That's not what a compliment is." "It's what I think a compliment is." "Your personal definition doesn't change the actual definition. It changes my definition." Adrian walked slightly behind this exchange and listened to it, and thought about what he'd missed and what he had now, and tried to find a clean way to separate those two things, and found, as he always found, that he couldn't. They were the same thing. The missing was the shape the having had to grow around, and the having was partly made of the missing, and neither could exist without the other. He didn't think that was a tragedy. He thought that was just what was true. Naomi fell into step beside him, somewhere in the middle of the promenade. She didn't comment on it. Neither did he. Ahead of them, the boys were still arguing about the definition of a compliment, with the dedicated energy of people who have no stake in the outcome but find the argument genuinely interesting. "Miles is going to win that," Naomi said. "He already won it. He's just being patient." "He's always patient. That's the most frightening thing about him." A pause. "He told me last week that he wants to study structural engineering. He's 9. He's been telling me what he wants to do since he was 5. He changes it approximately never." She watched her sons for a moment. "He also said he wants to work with you on the foundation projects eventually." "Not now." "Eventually." Adrian looked at her. "I'm just passing the message along," she said. "He asked me to." "Why didn't he tell me himself?" "Because Miles conveys things that matter to him through intermediaries until he's certain they'll be received correctly." She paused. He was certain about this one. He just wanted there to be a witness. Adrian thought about a boy who had said the data set is still too small and meant it, who had needed months of evidence before he'd let anything through the careful exterior, who had shown Adrian his testing apparatus before his own mother and called it a decision about data, but had meant something else entirely. He thought about what it cost, to be a child who needed that much safety before he could trust. He thought about what had made Miles that way, and whose decisions had shaped that particular economy of caution in a 9-year-old who was otherwise extraordinary. He carried that. He didn't perform carrying it. He just did. "Tell him I'd be honored," Adrian said. Naomi nodded. They walked. The water moved beside them, patient and indifferent in the way water was, unconcerned with the people walking its edge. The promenade had been open for 7 months, and it already looked like it had been there longer, the way good public spaces did, the ones that were designed to absorb the life of the people who used them rather than resist it. Owen had run ahead to the north end, where the view opened widest, and he was standing at the railing with his arms out in a way that suggested he was either testing the wind or simply being Owen. Noah was writing in his notebook, walking and writing simultaneously in a manner that seemed inadvisable, but apparently worked for him. Miles was examining the expansion joint in the promenade surface with an attention that would have seemed odd in any other 9-year-old. Naomi stopped walking. Adrian stopped beside her. The city rose behind the promenade, the skyline she had helped reshape, the work of years made visible in the line of towers and the lighter mass of the residential buildings and the open waterfront that should have been public for decades and now was. Her firm's name was not on any of it. CNC didn't brand its projects, which was a choice she'd made early and held to. But the design was in every visible decision, the preference for sightlines over revenue, the setbacks and the proportions and the north curve of the promenade that Miles had identified immediately and approved of without being asked. She had built all of it, from nothing, from the wreckage of a life someone else had dismantled, using her own hands and her own mind and the particular stubbornness of a person who had decided that the thing someone else destroyed would not be the last word in her story. It had not been the last word. Adrian stood beside her and looked at the city she'd helped build and thought about the difference between the billionaire who had walked into a conference room a year ago, certain of the negotiation, running 4 minutes late, carrying 8 years of carefully managed not seeing, and the man standing on a January promenade now, or a May soccer field, or a December garage, or a Christmas morning. He could not locate the border between those two men. They were the same person. The circumstances had changed, and the choices had changed, and something underneath had also changed, slowly, the way things change when they're examined rather than managed. He had examined it. He was still examining it. That was the most honest thing he knew about the process of becoming accountable. It didn't finish. It didn't arrive at a clean resolution where the ledger balanced and the debt was paid and you could put it down. You carried it forward. The weight changed over time, became more familiar, stopped being something you fought, and became something you simply moved with, the way you moved with all the heaviest true things. What he knew now that he hadn't known before was that the weight did not cancel out the other things. The good things, the Miles things, and the Owen things, and the Noah calls from school offices things, and the Naomi laughed today things, both were real, both were present. The loss did not erase the finding, and the finding did not erase the loss. He had 3 sons who were extraordinary in ways that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with their mother, and he had the improbable daily privilege of being present for who they were becoming, and that was a fortune he had not earned and could not have purchased, and was only in his possession because a woman he had hurt had decided, slowly, carefully, with full awareness of the risk, that it might be possible for the future to be different from the past. That decision was hers. She had made it on her own terms and in her own time, and without any obligation to make it. He would never stop understanding that. Naomi was still looking at the skyline. Then she turned slightly, not quite toward him. "Stop thinking so loudly," she said. "Sorry. You do this. You get this expression." "What expression?" "Like you're writing a reckoning in your head, and it's taking a while." She was looking at him now, directly, with the expression that was no longer closed. "It's over, Adrian. The legal part, the Victor part. It's done." "I know. The rest of it is this." She gestured, small and precise, at the 5 of them on the promenade. "This is the rest of it. Walking and arguing about compliments and Miles examining the expansion joints because he cannot help himself." "I know." "Then stop looking like you're still in a courtroom." He looked at her. She looked back at him. It was not a romantic moment in the way of films. No music, no golden light, no perfect speech. It was a cold late afternoon on a public promenade with her 3 sons visible at various points along the railing, one of whom was definitely still arguing about the definition of a compliment, and the city behind them going about its ordinary Saturday, and Naomi looking at him with an expression that was open and careful and real and tired of being either more or less than what it was. He reached out and she did not move back, and he took her hand in the particular way of something that was a question and an answer at the same time. And she looked down at their hands and then up at him, and whatever she was decided quietly in the space of a breath, the way the most important decisions always were. "Okay," she said. Not a verdict, not a resolution, just the next thing. Ahead of them, Owen had turned from the railing and spotted them and made a sound that was entirely too triumphant for a 9-year-old and was immediately shushed by Noah, who told him not to make it weird, which made Owen say he was not making it weird, he was celebrating, and Miles looked at both of them with the expression of a person who had already known this was coming and had simply been waiting for the data set to catch up. They walked. All 5 of them. Back along the promenade in the fading August light, the water beside them and the city ahead, the skyline Naomi had helped build rising against the evening sky, and the ordinary sound of 3 boys and 2 people who had found their way back to each other through the most imperfect, costly, humanly complicated road available. That was the story. Not the scandal or the lawsuit or the billions or the headlines. The story was this: a promenade on an August evening, and a family that had not been a family for most of its existence, learning what it meant to become one now. It would not always be easy. Miles would still need time and evidence before he trusted new things. Noah would still ask the hard questions directly and wait for direct answers. Owen would still assume the best, and be mostly right about it and occasionally heartbreakingly wrong. Naomi would still be the one who had built the foundation, and she would still carry the knowledge of what it had cost, and there would be days when the past was closer than she wanted it to be. And Adrian would keep showing up, not because he had earned the right to, not because the account was settled, but because showing up imperfectly and consistently was the only form of love that had ever been real. The kind that did not wait for the perfect moment or the clean resolution, but arrived at ordinary Tuesday evenings and wet soccer Saturdays and Christmas mornings and hardware stores and parking lots and August promenades, building itself out of the small and the real until the small and the real became, unmistakably, everything. The city held them. The water moved. The light went the way light goes.